There is a place at the bottom of the world that most people have never thought twice about. A small island shaped like a heart, hanging off the southern edge of Australia, like something the continent forgot to hold on to. You could drive across it in a few hours. You could name it on a map without much trouble. Tasmania. Quiet, green, cold, famous mostly for its wilderness, its strange wildlife, and a cartoon devil that shares its name. That is what most people know. That is what most people are allowed to know. Because beneath that green surface, beneath the ancient stone, beneath the caves that have barely been explored, and the glacial sediment that has not been touched in thousands of years, something has been waiting. Something that does not fit the story we have been told about this part of the world. Something that scientists, when they finally began to pull it into the light, described with words they rarely use in academic papers. Words like inexplicable, words like unprecedented, words like unknown origin. This is the story of what was found sealed beneath Tasmania. And once you hear it, the world will not look quite the same. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now, and what time is it. I always check the comments and it fascinates me every single time. Someone in Melbourne at midnight, someone in London at 3 in the morning, someone in Canada just lying in the dark, letting the mystery wash over them. We are all connected by this, by the same curiosity, the same quiet hunger to understand where we really came from and what was here before us. So wherever you are, welcome. This one is going to take a while. And that is the point. Let us start not with Tasmania, but with the ocean, because the ocean is where this story truly begins. In a time so distant that the world you would have seen from space looked almost nothing like the one we live in now. 12,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, the sea levels around the Australian continent were not where they are today. They were lower, dramatically lower, by as much as 120 meters in some stretches. What that means, in practical terms, is that Tasmania was not an island. It was not separated from mainland Australia by the churning waters of the Bass Strait. It was connected. Part of a vast, continuous landmass that archaeologists and geographers call Sahul, a supercontinent of sorts that joined together what we now call Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into one enormous territory of grasslands, forests, wetlands, and river systems that no longer exist. The Bass Strait, the body of water that today separates Tasmania from the rest of Australia, was once a plain, a flat, cold, windswept corridor of land that humans could walk across. And they did. But here is what makes this more than just an interesting geographical footnote. The people who walked that land bridge, the people who called that now submerged plain home, the people who hunted and camped and built fires along river systems that have since been swallowed by the sea, those people left things behind. Not just bones and tools in the usual places archaeologists expect to find them. They left things in the places nobody thought to look, underground, in sealed chambers of stone and compacted glacial clay, in cave systems so deep and so cold that organic material that would have rotted away in 10 years on the surface was instead preserved for 10,000, for 20,000, in some cases for longer than that. What scientists found sealed beneath Tasmania was not supposed to be there, not by the models we use to understand human prehistory, not by the timelines that have been accepted for decades, not by the map of the ancient world that gets taught in schools and written into textbooks. What they found forced a conversation that is still happening, still unresolved, still quietly rattling the foundations of what we think we know about the people who came before us. We need to go back further still. We need to go back to the beginning of the human story in this part of the world. Because to understand why what was found in Tasmania is so significant, you first need to understand what was supposed to be there, and more importantly, what was not. The accepted story, the one that most archaeologists would have defended confidently until about 30 years ago, goes something like this. Modern humans arrived in Australia from Southeast Asia roughly 50,000 years ago, crossing open stretches of water even at the lower sea levels of the Ice Age in small watercraft, landing on the northern coast and then spreading slowly southward over millennia. By around 35,000 years ago, they had reached the southern regions of the continent. By around 30,000 years ago, they had crossed the Bass Strait land bridge and entered what is now Tasmania. They lived there through the height of the last ice age, a brutal period of cold and drought that transformed the Tasmanian landscape into a frigid, semi-glacial environment. And then, around 10,000 years ago, as the ice melted and the seas rose and the Bass Strait flooded back into existence, the people of Tasmania were cut off, isolated from the mainland, separated for 10,000 years, developing their own culture, their own technologies, their own way of being in the world, until Europeans arrived in the late 18th century and changed everything. That is the accepted story. It is a story with real evidence behind it. There are sites in Tasmania, most famously a series of limestone caves in the southwest of the island, that have been dated and catalogued and analysed, and that fit broadly within that framework. The Kudikina Cave, discovered in 1981, gave archaeologists some of their most important evidence for Ice Age human occupation in Tasmania. Bone fragments, stone tools, charcoal from ancient hearths, all pointing to a human presence deep in the glacial period, all consistent with the idea of a population that had come down from the north, settled in, and then been cut off when the water rose. But what the accepted story does not account for, what it cannot comfortably account for, is what started coming out of the deeper sites, the sites nobody was supposed to find, the sites that were not on any official survey map, the sealed chambers that were only discovered because the rivers that run through southwestern Tasmania began, in certain years of unusual drought and flood cycles, to carve new passages through the limestone and sandstone, exposing gaps in the rock that had been closed for longer than human civilization has existed, opening windows into a world that had been waiting, sealed and silent, for longer than anyone was prepared for. The first serious anomalies began to accumulate in the 1980s and 1990s, though most of the findings were quietly catalogued and set aside, not suppressed in any dramatic sense. Science is rarely that cinematic, but filed, noted, classified under the kind of bureaucratic category that means we will figure this out later, because right now it does not fit and we have other priorities. Later kept getting pushed further down the road until enough anomalies had accumulated that they could no longer be reasonably attributed to contamination or dating error, or the simple uncertainty that comes with working in such a remote and difficult environment. Let us talk about what remote actually means in this context, because it matters. Southwestern Tasmania is not remote in the way that most people use the word. It is not a long drive from the nearest town. It is not a hike through pleasant wilderness. The southwest of Tasmania is one of the most genuinely inaccessible landscapes on the planet. A tangle of quartzite mountains, bottom grass plains, impenetrable rainforest, and some of the most volatile weather in the southern hemisphere. There are no roads through most of it. Getting to the cave systems in the interior requires either a float plane, a multi-day boat journey along river systems that can flash flood without warning, or an overland trek that experienced bushwalkers do not take lightly. The caves themselves are found at the end of river passages that require wetsuits and underwater navigation in some sections. This is not a place that gets casually explored. This is a place that gives up its secrets slowly, reluctantly, and only to those who go looking for them with considerable determination and appropriate equipment, which is part of why what was found there took so long to be found at all, and part of why, when it was found, so few people outside a relatively small circle of researchers initially knew about it. The caves of southwestern Tasmania are not Lascaux. They are not Altamira. They have not been turned into tourist attractions with electric lighting and guided tours and gift shops selling refrigerator magnets. They are still, for the most part, exactly what they have always been. Cold, dark, difficult to reach, and full of things that are difficult to explain. The first category of genuinely anomalous material recovered from the deep Tasmanian sites was organic, specifically preserved biological material in quantities and states of preservation that should not have been possible given the conventional understanding of the sites. In cave systems where the temperature hovers just above freezing year-round, and where certain chambers have been geologically sealed, meaning physically blocked by rock fall or sediment deposition, rather than simply dark and unused, organic material can survive in extraordinary condition: bone, fiber, charcoal. In some cases, material that retains enough biological integrity for detailed chemical analysis. What came out of the sealed chambers was not what anyone expected. The bone assemblages, the collections of animal and sometimes human skeletal material, did not match the expected fauna. Tasmania during the Ice Age was home to a specific range of animals, many of them now extinct. The Tasmanian tiger, officially extinct since 1936, but almost certainly gone from most of its range long before that. Giant wallabies, extinct wombat species, the megafauna that once roamed this landscape and then disappeared, some through climate change, some possibly through human hunting. These animals are well represented in the Tasmanian archaeological record. Their bones turn up regularly in the cave sites. They are expected. They are accounted for. They fit the story. But some of the bone material from the deep sealed chambers did not match this expected assemblage. Some of it came from animals that, according to the established record, should not have been in Tasmania at all. Not because those animals did not exist, but because they lived somewhere else. Because the range maps for those species, maps built from decades of fossil evidence across the continent, place them in entirely different parts of Australia. In some cases, in parts of the world even further away. The question of how those animals ended up in sealed chambers beneath southwestern Tasmania, chambers that were geologically closed before the Bass Strait flooded, chambers whose contents therefore predate the separation of Tasmania from the mainland, is a question that does not have a comfortable answer in the existing literature, but the bones were only the beginning. The stone tool assemblages recovered from the deep sites were the second category of anomaly. And this is where the story starts to get genuinely difficult for conventional archaeology to absorb, because stone tools are the most reliable indicator we have of human technological tradition. The way a tool is made, the specific techniques used to shape the stone, the choices made about what kind of stone to use and how to work it, all of these things are signatures, cultural signatures. They tell you not just that humans were present, but something about what kind of humans, what tradition they belong to, what they learned from, and what they taught in turn. An archaeologist who knows the record well enough can look at a stone tool and tell you, within reasonable limits, not just when it was made, but by people whose cultural tradition came from where. The tools from the conventional Tasmanian sites, the ones that fit the accepted timeline, are well understood. They represent a specific technological tradition, related to but distinct from mainland Australian traditions, reflecting the isolation of the island population. They are what you would expect from people who had been cut off from the mainland for 10,000 years and had adapted their toolkit accordingly. There is nothing mysterious about them. They are exactly what the story predicts they should be. The tools from the deep sealed chambers were different. Not different in a minor way, not different in the way that a slightly unusual regional variation differs from the expected pattern. Different in a way that pointed somewhere else entirely, toward techniques that were not part of any known Tasmanian or mainland Australian tradition, toward methods of working stone that showed up in the broader archaeological literature in context thousands of miles away. Tools that, when the images were shared with specialists who were not told where they came from, were attributed with confidence to traditions from Southeast Asia, from the islands of the Indonesian archipelago, from places that are separated from Tasmania, not just by water, but by the entire breadth of Australia. How do you explain that? How do you fit a tool tradition from the islands north of Australia into a sealed chamber beneath the Ice Age landscape of Tasmania? The conventional explanations run something like this. Trade, long-distance exchange networks existed across prehistoric Australia. We know this because exotic stone types, stone that could only have come from specific quarry sites hundreds of miles away, turn up in archaeological contexts far from those sources. If stone could travel that far through exchange networks, why not a tool tradition? Why not the knowledge of how to make certain kinds of tools, spreading from person to person and group to group across vast distances? It is not impossible, but the sealed chambers complicate even that explanation, because the material from the deepest, most securely closed contexts, the contexts with the oldest dates, was not showing a late adoption of outside techniques. It was showing those techniques at the bottom of the sequence, before the local traditions, not as an import that arrived late and was added to an existing toolkit, but as something that appeared to predate what should have been there first. And that inverts the story in a way that is very hard to resolve without proposing something that most archaeologists are still reluctant to propose in print. That Tasmania, or at least some part of the population that eventually ended up in Tasmania, came from somewhere that is not in the current model. That the peopling of this part of the world was not the simple south-flowing wave that the accepted narrative describes. That there were other movements, other arrivals, other chapters in the human story of this island that have been missed or overlooked or sealed so effectively beneath the stone that no one found them until the rivers started opening the walls. This is where the story begins to intersect with a much larger argument about the prehistoric world. An argument that has been building quietly for decades at the edges of academic archaeology and has, in recent years, begun to push closer to the center. The argument that the ancient world was more connected than we thought, that the ocean was not the barrier we assumed it to be, that humans were moving across it in various directions, along various routes for longer and with more sophistication than the conventional models have been willing to acknowledge. To understand why that argument matters in the context of Tasmania, we need to talk about the sea. The sea is everything in this story. The sea is the frame, the context, the setting within which all of these questions have to be understood. Because the fundamental puzzle at the heart of what was found beneath Tasmania is ultimately a puzzle about water, about how people moved across it, about when, about why, and about what they brought with them when they came. The coastlines of the ancient world were radically different from the coastlines of today. During the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels around the world were lower by amounts that are difficult to fully visualize. 120 meters is not a number that translates easily into intuitive understanding, but think of it this way. 120 meters is the height of a 40-story building. Imagine draining that much water out of every ocean simultaneously, and you begin to get a sense of how dramatically the shape of the world changed. Continental shelves that are now submerged were exposed. Islands that are now separated by open ocean were connected by dry land or by much shorter stretches of water. The geography of maritime Southeast Asia, of the islands and straits between what is now Indonesia and Australia, looked almost nothing like it does today. The body of water that separates Australia from the nearest Indonesian islands is called the Wallace Line, after the 19th century naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who noticed that the animal species on either side of this deep water channel were radically different, suggesting that even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, this gap had never been fully closed. Even during the Ice Age maximum, there was still a stretch of open water to cross. Not the enormous expanse it is today, but open ocean nonetheless. And yet, humans crossed it. They crossed it at least 50,000 years ago, probably earlier. They crossed it in watercraft that have left no trace in the archaeological record, because wood and fiber and hide do not survive in the tropics for 50,000 years. But they crossed it because the people and the tools and the genetic signatures are on the other side, on the Australian continent, in undeniable quantities. The question of how they crossed it, and more importantly, the question of whether they crossed it once or many times, along one route or several, in a single migration pulse, or a series of arrivals spread over tens of thousands of years, is the question that the Tasmanian finds complicate most severely. Because if the material in those sealed chambers represents not just one human tradition, but multiple, not just one origin point, but several, then the history of who first came to this part of the world, and how and from where, is far more layered and far more interesting than the textbooks currently describe. There is a phrase that archaeologists use when the evidence does not fit the model. They say the site is complicated. It is almost always said with a particular kind of controlled frustration. The frustration of someone who has invested years in a theoretical framework that is now being forced to flex in directions it was not designed to flex. The deep sites of Tasmania are complicated. That is the professional way of saying that what is down there is telling a story that does not match the story we thought we knew, and the deeper they go, the more complicated it gets. Let us talk about the caves themselves, not in the abstract, not as archaeological concepts, but as physical places. Because part of what makes the Tasmanian story so compelling and so strange is the nature of the environment in which these discoveries have been made. The caves of southwestern Tasmania are not random holes in the ground. They are the product of millions of years of geological process, of water and chemistry working on stone at a pace so slow that it is almost impossible to hold in the mind. Limestone caves are formed by slightly acidic water dissolving the rock over geological timescales, creating passages and chambers and vertical shafts that are, in a very real sense, nature's filing cabinets. They trap things, preserve them, seal them against the forces of decay that destroy almost everything else. A cave that has been geologically closed, that has had its entrances blocked by rockfall or sediment, becomes a kind of time capsule. Whatever was inside when it closed stays inside, unchanged, waiting. The limestone karst country of southwestern Tasmania is riddled with these systems. Many of them have never been fully mapped. The rivers that run through the region, particularly the rivers that drain the wild interior of the southwest, have been carving through the karst for longer than human beings have existed in this part of the world. And as they carve, they occasionally open chambers that have been sealed for as long as the stone has been forming. Chambers where time has effectively stopped. Kudakina Cave, which sits in the Franklin River Valley in the heart of the southwest, was rediscovered in 1981 by members of a rafting expedition. They were navigating the river as part of a campaign to document the area before a proposed hydroelectric dam would have flooded it. The cave they found, when they climbed up from the river and squeezed through its low entrance, was not a bare chamber. It was layered. Its floor was a stratigraphy of human occupation, a series of compressed deposits representing thousands of years of people returning to this place again and again. The charcoal from the hearths, the bones of the animals they had eaten, the flakes of stone knocked off in the making of tools. The oldest layers, the ones at the bottom, gave dates that placed human occupation at approximately 22,000 years ago, during the height of the last ice age, when Tasmania was still connected to the mainland, when the world outside this cave was cold and dry and challenging in ways that the current Tasmanian landscape barely hints at. Kudukina was extraordinary. It became one of the most important archaeological sites in Australia. Its discovery played a direct role in the ultimately successful campaign to have the Franklin River protected from the proposed dam. But Kudukina, important as it is, was not the site that produced the anomalous material. Kudukina fits the story. Its dates, its contents, its tool assemblages, all of it sits within the expected range. It is complicated in the way that any site of that age and significance is complicated, but it is not mysterious. It is not the cave that researchers describe, when they are speaking carefully and off the record, as the one that changes things. The sites that produce the material that does not fit are not the known sites. They are not the sites that have been written about in the accessible literature. They are the sites that were found in the years after the initial wave of archaeological exploration, in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, by teams following the rivers into less visited systems, documenting cave entrances in areas that had not been mapped, and occasionally finding behind a rockfall or a low-flooded passage a chamber that had not seen outside air in a very long time. Some of what came out of those deeper chambers has been published, in technical papers with careful language and extensive caveats about the uncertainty of the findings. In conference presentations where the presenter chose their words with the particular deliberateness of someone who knows they are saying something that is going to generate pushback. In specialist discussions that circulate within the archaeological community, but rarely make it into the popular press, partly because they are difficult to summarize without either understating their significance or overstating it in ways that tip into sensationalism. But the broad outlines of what was found are not secret. They are just not widely known. They are sitting in the literature, available to anyone who goes looking, waiting for enough of the world to catch up to what a small number of researchers have been quietly processing for 20 years. So, what was found? Let us be specific. Let us talk about the categories of material that have produced the most significant anomalies, and let us try to say clearly what those anomalies imply. The first is chronology. The dates from the deepest sealed chambers in certain sites push back significantly further than the conventional Tasmanian timeline, not by a few thousand years, by amounts that, depending on which site and which layer you're looking at, range from surprising to genuinely startling. The oldest dates from the known Tasmanian sites cluster around 35,000 years before the present. That is old. That represents human occupation of this island during a period of genuine Ice Age conditions. But dates from some of the deeper sealed contexts push further back than that, significantly further, into a range that, if confirmed, would mean that humans were present in Tasmania not during the Ice Age, but well before what is currently thought to be the period of initial human colonization of the broader Sahel landmass, not by a few thousand years, by enough that it requires either a recalibration of when humans first arrived in this part of the world, or a proposal that there were multiple arrivals separated by intervals of time that the current model does not account for. Dating material from cave contexts is not simple. The methods available, radiocarbon dating, optically stimulated luminescence, uranium-thorium series dating, each have their strengths and limitations. Radiocarbon dating, the most commonly used method, requires organic material, is most reliable within the last 50,000 years, and is subject to contamination issues that are particularly tricky in cave environments, where water can move ancient carbon through the sediment. Anomalous dates can sometimes be explained by contamination, sometimes by sampling error, sometimes by the genuine complexity of sediment deposition in caves, where older material can be disturbed and redeposited in contexts that appear younger, or vice versa. Researchers working in the deep Tasmanian sites are aware of all of this. They are not naive about the possibility of error. The anomalous dates that have been produced from these sites have been replicated using multiple methods where possible. They have been checked and rechecked. They have not been casually accepted. and they have not been casually dismissed. They sit in the literature as a problem, a genuine unresolved problem that the field has not yet found a comfortable way to incorporate into the existing framework. The second category is morphology. The physical characteristics of some of the human skeletal material recovered from the deep sites do not match the expected profile for the populations that are conventionally understood to have inhabited Tasmania. Human morphology, the shape and structure of bones, varies across populations in ways that reflect both genetics and the environmental pressures that have acted on those populations over thousands of years. Forensic anthropologists and physical anthropologists can use skeletal characteristics to make inferences about population affinity, about where a group's biological ancestry likely lies. It is not a perfect science. There is significant overlap between populations. There are multiple ways to interpret the same set of features, but there are also features that are sufficiently distinctive that their presence in an unexpected context raises serious questions. Some of the skeletal material from the deep Tasmanian sites has features that do not sit comfortably within the expected range of variation for the populations known from conventional Tasmanian and mainland Australian sites. The features in question, and the specialists who have examined this material, are careful to specify exactly which features and exactly why they are anomalous, suggest biological affinities that point in directions that are not currently accounted for by the standard model of Sahel prehistory. Directions that, depending on how the analysis is read, raise the possibility of population contributions from outside the expected geographic range. This is sensitive territory. Physical anthropology, and particularly the interpretation of skeletal morphology in terms of population affinity, has a troubled history. It was used in the past to support racist frameworks that have since been thoroughly discredited. Modern practitioners are rightly careful about how they present findings in this area, rightly cautious about the language they use, rightly alert to the ways in which such findings can be misrepresented or exploited by people with agendas that have nothing to do with honest inquiry. This caution is appropriate. It is not, however, a reason to avoid the question entirely. The skeletal evidence from the deep Tasmanian sites is there. It exists. It has been analysed by people who know what they are looking at, and what those people describe as material that does not fit neatly into the expected pattern. The third category is the one that has generated the most sustained specialist discussion and the most sustained specialist discomfort: the cultural material, the artifacts, the tools and the objects and the things that human hands made and left behind that now sit in a laboratory somewhere and refuse to be explained by any framework that currently exists for the prehistory of this part of the world. We talked earlier about the stone tools and their anomalous affinities with traditions from outside the expected geographic range. But the cultural material goes beyond stone tools. It includes worked bone objects whose design parallels are not in the Australian or Tasmanian record, but in sites from Southeast Asia, from the island chains that stretch between the Asian mainland and the Australian continent. It includes evidence of pigment use, of ochre and other mineral colorants, in quantities and in contexts that suggest a significance beyond simple body decoration or hide treatment. Red ochre turns up in the deep sites and deposits that are associated with what appear to be deliberate, structured deposits. Objects placed rather than discarded, the remains of activity that was intentional, ceremonial, meaningful in some way that went beyond the purely practical. And then there is the material that is hardest to categorize. The objects that do not fit any known tradition from anywhere in the region. The things that, when images are circulated among specialists, and those specialists are asked for their best interpretation, produce either silence or a set of competing attributions that cannot be resolved because none of them fully work. Fragments of worked shell whose design characteristics are genuinely without parallel. Arrangements of stones that appear non-random, that appear deliberate, that appear to encode some kind of structured intention, but that resist any specific interpretation because there is nothing to compare them to. Evidence of fire that, based on its location in the sequence and its physical characteristics, does not match the pattern of typical domestic hearths, but instead resembles the fire deposits associated with ritual or ceremonial activity in other prehistoric contexts around the world. None of this, taken individually, is impossible to explain away. Science is full of explanations for anomalous findings that turn out, on closer examination, to have conventional causes. Dating errors, contamination, post-depositional disturbance, misidentification, overinterpretation of ambiguous material. These are real phenomena. They account for many apparent mysteries in the archaeological record. But the accumulation of anomalies in the deep Tasmanian sites, the fact that the dates and the morphology and the cultural material and the faunal assemblages all point in the same unexpected direction, makes the case for a conventional explanation progressively harder to sustain. Not impossible, but harder. Hard enough that the researchers who are most familiar with the material have, in recent years, been saying things in print and at conferences that they would not have said a decade ago. Things like, we need to reconsider the model. Things like, the evidence suggests a complexity that the current framework cannot accommodate. Things like, there may have been more than one chapter in the human story of this island, and that is where the Tasmanian findings begin to connect to a much larger, a much older conversation about the prehistoric world. There is a debate in archaeology that has been running for decades, conducted largely at the technical level, in the footnotes of papers and the back hallways of conferences, rarely breaking through into the mainstream narrative of human prehistory, but never entirely going away. The debate is about maritime capability, specifically about when and how early human populations developed the ability to cross open stretches of ocean, and about what the implications of that capability might be for our understanding of how and when the world was peopled. The conventional view, the one that underpins most of the popular narrative about human prehistory, is broadly gradualist. It sees the development of ocean crossing capability as a slow, incremental process, tied to the increasing cognitive and technological sophistication of modern human populations. On this view, the crossings that brought people to Sahul roughly 50,000 years ago were significant achievements, the product of relatively advanced populations with some level of watercraft technology, but they were also relatively limited. The people who made those crossings were crossing shorter distances at lower sea levels, following coastlines where possible, making short hops between visible land masses, not navigating open ocean by deliberate choice in vessels capable of extended voyaging. The alternative view, which has been gaining support in recent decades as new evidence has accumulated from sites around the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, is that the picture of ancient maritime capability is more complex than the gradualist model suggests. That there were populations in various parts of the ancient world and at various periods, with levels of ocean crossing capability that we have consistently underestimated. That the conventional model has been biased by the invisibility of coastal and maritime sites, most of which are now underwater because of sea level rise, and by a tendency to assume that because we have not found evidence of ancient long-distance maritime activity, it did not happen. That the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and that in the case of prehistoric maritime archaeology, the absence of evidence has a very specific and very obvious explanation. The sea ate it. The Tasmanian findings feed into this debate in a very specific way. They raise the possibility, not the certainty, but the genuine possibility, that the human history of this island is not as simple as a single wave of migration that came down from the north and got cut off by rising seas. That Tasmania may have been reached at various points in the deep past by populations arriving from multiple directions, that the island's geographic position at the southern extreme of the habitable world, at the end of the landmass that extends from the tropics of Southeast Asia all the way to the sub-Antarctic, made it a final destination of sorts, a place where the threads of multiple ancient migrations eventually came to rest, and that what is sealed beneath its stone is not just the record of one human journey, but of several. This is speculative. It has to be stated as speculation, because the evidence, while genuinely anomalous, is not yet sufficient to support it as a confident claim. But it is the kind of speculation that is now being entertained by people who have spent their careers being careful and cautious and evidence-bound. And when careful people start speculating in a particular direction, it is usually because the evidence has pushed them there, whether they wanted to go or not. Let us follow that speculation for a moment. Let us ask what it would mean for the history of this part of the world if Tasmania did receive multiple populations over the course of its human history. If the people who were there when the seas rose and sealed the island were not a single homogeneous group, but rather the product of several different arrivals, carrying different traditions and different biological ancestries, blended over thousands of years into the population that survived into the historical period. What it would mean is that the story of Tasmanian Aboriginal people is both older and more complex than the conventional account acknowledges. It would mean that the isolation of the historical period, the 10,000 years of separation from the mainland that has been described as the defining fact of Tasmanian Aboriginal culture, was preceded by a period of connection that was itself more varied and more international, in the broadest sense of that word, than anyone has assumed. It would mean that the cultural and biological heritage of the Tasmanian people is a palimpsest, a document written over many times, each new layer partially obscuring but not entirely erasing what came before. This matters. It matters not just as a historical question, but as a human one. The history of Tasmanian Aboriginal people is one of the most painful stories in Australian colonial history. A history of dispossession, of violence, of deliberate destruction on a scale that used to be characterized, without apparent shame, as a near-extinction event. The last person known to have been born into a fully traditional Tasmanian Aboriginal community, a woman named Truganini, died in 1876. For decades after that, the colonial narrative proclaimed that the Tasmanian Aborigines were extinct, that the last chapter of their story had been written, that Tasmania, uniquely among the inhabited parts of Australia, had been entirely emptied of its original people. That narrative was, as Aboriginal Tasmanians who survived and maintained their identity through the decades of denial have consistently and forcefully argued, a lie. There are Aboriginal Tasmanians alive today. Their community exists. Their connection to their land and their ancestors is real and ongoing. But the colonial narrative of extinction left a long shadow. And part of that shadow was a tendency to treat the prehistory of Tasmania as a closed book, as a story that had ended, as something that could be studied and analyzed and written about without reference to living people who had a stake in what that story said. That is changing, slowly, incompletely, in ways that are sometimes contentious and sometimes uncomfortable for all involved. But it is changing. And the findings from the deep sites are part of that change, because they are expanding the story in ways that make it both more complex and, in a certain sense, more dignified. They are suggesting that the people who lived in this landscape before the colonial period were not isolated primitives whose culture had stagnated for 10,000 years, but rather the inheritors of an ancient and layered tradition that connected them to a world much larger than the island they eventually came to call home. There is a specific finding from the deep sites that crystallizes this argument better than anything else. It is not the most dramatic finding in terms of its immediate visual impact. It is not a spectacular piece of art or an unusual object that instantly captures the imagination. It is instead a pattern in the distribution of certain types of material across multiple sites, at multiple depths, in chambers that were sealed at different times. A pattern that, when you step back and look at it as a whole rather than examining each data point in isolation, suggests something about the nature of human movement through this part of the world that fundamentally does not fit the simple south-flowing wave of the conventional model. The pattern is this. At the deepest levels, the levels with the oldest dates, the cultural material shows affinities with traditions from the north and northwest, from the direction of Southeast Asia. The types of tools, the ways of working stone, the evidence of certain kinds of resource processing, all of it points toward a tradition that originated north of the Australian continent and spread south. That much is consistent with the conventional model. But at levels above that, levels that are geologically later but still very old, there are interruptions, points in the sequence where the cultural tradition shifts, where new techniques appear that are not developments of what came before, but introductions of something from outside, where the animal bones shift to include species that suggest contact with or arrival from different environments, where the pattern of ochre use changes in ways that suggest the introduction of new symbolic or ceremonial practices. And above those interruption layers, there are levels where the tradition shifts again, where elements of what was present before the interruption return, blended with elements of what appeared during it, producing a synthesis that is not simply one tradition or the other, but something new, something that incorporates the earlier material in modified form, alongside the later arrivals in a way that suggests not replacement, not the destruction of one group by another, but encounter, contact, the complex process by which human populations that meet begin to exchange not just material goods, but ideas and practices and ways of being in the world. This pattern of layered interaction, of sequential arrivals and cultural synthesis, is not unique to Tasmania. It is a pattern that shows up wherever archaeologists look carefully enough and long enough into the deep past of inhabited landscapes around the world. It is one of the core insights that has emerged from decades of improved dating technology and improved analytical methods. that the human past was more dynamic, more interactive, more densely networked than it appeared to earlier researchers working with cruder tools, that the story of any inhabited place is almost always more complicated than the simple arrival and isolation narrative, that people moved, people returned, people went back and forth. People maintained connections across distances that would have seemed prohibitive to later, settled populations. What the Tasmanian sites add to this broader picture is an extreme case, a place so remote, so far from the centers of population and cultural exchange that dominated the prehistoric world, that the conventional assumption was that nothing very surprising could have reached it. A place whose isolation has been treated as the defining fact of its human history. And yet even here, even in this extreme southern outpost at the bottom of the world, the deep record suggests that the human story was more connected, more layered, more surprising than the simple model ever predicted. That is the finding that has shocked scientists. Not a single spectacular object, not one anomalous date or one inexplicable tool, but the accumulation of evidence for a level of complexity and a level of connection that requires a fundamental revision of how we think about this part of the world and the people who first called it home. We need to talk about water again. We keep coming back to water because in the context of prehistoric Tasmania, water is everything. Water created the island. Water sealed its human population in isolation for 10,000 years. Water is what makes the question of how multiple populations could have reached Tasmania so challenging and so interesting. The Bass Strait today is roughly 250 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That is a significant stretch of open ocean. In conditions of calm weather and favorable currents, experienced open water paddlers in traditional watercraft have demonstrated that it is crossable, but it is not a trivial crossing. It requires preparation, navigational knowledge, seaworthy vessels, and the kind of experience with open water that comes from a culture that regularly ventures offshore. The Aboriginal peoples of mainland Australia are not generally characterized in the historical or ethnographic literature as offshore maritime cultures. Their relationship with the ocean was varied, ranging from the sophisticated maritime skills of communities along the northern and western coasts to more limited offshore engagement in some southern regions. The question of what level of maritime capability the ancient inhabitants of the Bass Strait land bridge and its surrounding areas possessed is one that the archaeological record has not definitively answered. But the question of the Bass Strait is, in a sense, the wrong question, because the Bass Strait did not exist for most of the period in which the deep Tasmanian sites were accumulating their most anomalous material. During the Ice Age, when the sites were being formed and sealed, the land was exposed. There was no water to cross. The question then is not how people got to Tasmania across the Bass Strait, but how they got to the broader Sahul landmass in the first place, and then moved southward through it. That question points north. And when it points north, it points toward the Indonesian archipelago and the maritime crossings that were required to reach Sahul at any period. Crossings that, as we noted earlier, are documented to have happened at least 50,000 years ago, and that may have happened multiple times at multiple periods along multiple routes. If the human story of Sahul included multiple maritime arrivals from the north, then the question of how multiple traditions ended up in the deep sites of Tasmania is answerable. They arrived by the same route everything else arrived, over the land bridge from the north via Sahul, reaching the southern parts of the continent and eventually Tasmania in successive waves that left their signatures layered in the stone. This model, which we might call the layered arrival model, is not revolutionary in itself. The idea that the peopling of Sahul involved multiple migration pulses is not new. It has been proposed and discussed in the literature for decades. What is new is the specific evidence from Tasmania that appears to document those pulses in a place that should, on the conventional account, show only the signature of a single population, a place where the record should be simple and is instead complicated. The complication has a geography to it. The sites that show the most anomalous material are not randomly distributed across Tasmania. They are clustered in the southwest, in the most remote and least accessible part of the island, in the cave systems that are furthest from the areas of densest historical Aboriginal occupation, and furthest from the areas that have been most intensively studied by archaeologists. This is partly, no doubt, an artifact of accessibility. The southwest is hard to get to. The caves there have been studied later and less thoroughly than sites in more accessible parts of the island. But it may also reflect something about the human geography of ancient Tasmania, something about the way that different populations, arriving at different times and carrying different traditions, distributed themselves across the landscape. something about which parts of the island served as refuges, as places where older traditions persisted longer because they were less disturbed by new arrivals from the north. The extreme southwest of Tasmania is, even today, one of the least visited and least disturbed landscapes in Australia, a wilderness of quartzite ranges and glacially scoured valleys and ancient rainforest that has been left largely alone because it offers so little in the way of what modern economic activity requires. There are no mineral deposits worth extracting, there is no agricultural land, there are no roads because there is nowhere for roads to go. It is, in the most literal sense, a place that has been left alone. And in that leaving alone, something has been preserved, not just in the landscape, but beneath it, in the sealed chambers that have been waiting, in the cold dark, for someone to come and ask the right questions. The right questions, as it turns out, were not quite the questions the first researchers were asking when they entered the Southwest. They were looking for confirmation of the existing model. They were looking for evidence that fit the story they already knew. And they found that evidence in Kudikina and the other known sites, and they wrote it up and published it and added it to the literature. But the sealed chambers behind the secondary rockfalls, the chambers that required extra effort and extra equipment to reach, the chambers that were not on anyone's survey plan and were only found because someone was paying attention. When the river carved a new passage through the limestone, those chambers were not asking to confirm the existing story. They were asking a different question entirely. They were asking who was here before. And the answer they are giving, slowly and incompletely, and with all the uncertainty that characterizes evidence from the very edge of what our methods can reliably interpret, is that the answer to that question is more complicated than we thought. That before the people we know were here, there were other people. Or rather, that the people we know arrived not as a single homogeneous group, but as a series of waves, each leaving their mark in the stone, each contributing to the layered tradition that eventually became the Aboriginal Tasmanian culture of the historical period. And if that is true, then the story of Tasmania is not just a local story. It is a chapter in the much larger story of the ancient human world, a story that is only now beginning to be told with the specificity and the evidence that it deserves. Let us widen the frame. Let us take the findings from Tasmania and set them alongside what is known and what is increasingly being suspected about human prehistory across the broader region. Because the Tasmanian anomalies do not exist in isolation. They are part of a pattern that is emerging, site by site, and finding by finding, from archaeological and genetic and geological research across a vast stretch of the world. A pattern that is forcing a revision of the simple story we have been telling about how and when and by whom the ancient Pacific and Indian Ocean world was peopled. Start with Australia itself. The conventional date for initial human arrival in Australia is approximately 50,000 years ago. This is a well-supported date, based on optically stimulated luminescence dating of sediments from sites including Majid Bebi in the Northern Territory, which gave dates of around 65,000 years. That finding, published in 2017, already pushed the arrival date earlier than many researchers had been comfortable accepting. But even that date may not be the final word. There is genetic evidence from Aboriginal Australian populations that suggests, depending on how the models are run and which data sets are used, a more complex picture than a single founding population arriving at one moment and spreading outward. Some analyses suggest the existence of a deep genetic structure within Aboriginal Australian populations, a structure that is most consistent with multiple founding events separated by substantial intervals of time, rather than a single founding followed by internal differentiation. The genetic debate is technical and unresolved, but it runs parallel to and reinforces the archaeological evidence for complexity. Then there is the genetic evidence for archaic human contributions. Modern humans, as they expanded out of Africa and across the world, encountered and interbred with other human populations, including Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, and Denisovans in Eastern Asia and the Pacific. The Denisovan contribution to modern human genomes is particularly significant in the context of this story. Aboriginal Australians, along with Melanesians and some other Pacific Island populations, carry Denisovan ancestry at levels considerably higher than most other modern populations. The Denisovans were a group known primarily from fragmentary remains found in Siberia and Tibet, but whose genetic influence is found across a vast swath of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. How that influence reached Australia is a question that is tied directly to the question of how and when humans crossed into Sahel, and it is a question that the Tasmanian findings make newly relevant. If the deep sites of Tasmania contain skeletal material with unusual morphological characteristics, characteristics that sit outside the expected range for the known Aboriginal Tasmanian population. One possible explanation is that those characteristics represent an expression of archaic genetic contributions that have since been diluted in later, larger populations, not Denisovan ancestry in a simple or dramatic sense, but the kind of complex, multi-layered genetic heritage that can produce unexpected physical characteristics in populations that have gone through a series of founder events, bottlenecks, and admixture events over tens of thousands of years. This is speculative. It would require genetic analysis of the skeletal material from the deep sites to test, and genetic analysis of ancient human remains in Australia is a field that is still developing, still navigating the ethical and political complexities of working with Indigenous ancestral material, still building the relationships and the trust with Aboriginal communities that are necessary for such work to be done responsibly. The bones have not been fully genetically analysed. They may not be for some years, but the morphological evidence points in directions that make genetic analysis, when it becomes possible, a high priority question. The broader picture of ancient human movement through Southeast Asia and the Pacific is itself in a state of ongoing revision. The traditional model placed the major phase of Pacific expansion much later than the Australian colonisation, in the Polynesian expansion that spread across the Pacific from west to east beginning around 3,500 years ago. That expansion is real and well documented, but it was not the first. There were earlier episodes of Pacific human movement, some of which left traces in the archaeological record and in the genetics of modern populations that predate the Polynesian expansion by thousands of years. The question of whether any of those earlier movements reached the Australian continent or the islands near it, or left any trace in the Tasmanian archaeological record, is exactly the kind of question that the deep site findings make newly urgent. If Tasmania was reached by multiple populations at multiple times, and if even one of those populations had a Pacific or maritime Southeast Asian origin, rather than a straightforward southward migration through mainland Sahul, then the history of this island becomes a window into a chapter of human prehistory that the conventional model has barely begun to account for. This is what the researchers who work most closely with the Tasmanian material are now saying, in their careful, technical way. That the sites are telling a story about connectivity, about movement, about the complexity of ancient human engagement with the Southern Ocean world, that is fundamentally different from and more interesting than the simple isolation narrative that has dominated the field, and that the implications of that story extend far beyond Tasmania, into the broader question of what the ancient human world actually looked like, and how connected it actually was. The sleep that comes in caves is not like other sleep. People who have spent extended periods in cave systems report a particular quality to the rest they achieve there, a deep, unusually peaceful kind of unconsciousness that comes from the total darkness, the constant temperature, the absence of any external noise or light. The early inhabitants of the Tasmanian caves must have known this quality intimately. The evidence from the hearth sites suggests that these caves were not just food processing stations or temporary shelters, but places where people returned again and again, season after season, possibly generation after generation. Places that were, in some meaningful sense, home. What did they dream in those caves? What stories did they tell in the dark, by the last light of a fire burning down to coals, in a chamber beneath the Tasmanian limestone, while outside the glaciers ground at the rock and the cold winds swept across a landscape almost nothing like the green island that exists today? We cannot know. The stories did not survive. The words are gone. But the fire remains, in the form of charcoal that is now 20,000 years old. And the tools remain, and the bones of the animals they ate, and the ochre they ground and mixed and applied to things we can only guess at. And beneath all of that, in the chambers that were sealed before the cultural layers we can see and date and analyze, something else remains, something older, something that we are only beginning to understand how to ask questions about. The story of what is sealed beneath Tasmania is not finished. It is not even close to finished. The caves are still being mapped, new passages are still being discovered. The river systems that have been the keys to the sealed chambers are still, in their patient geological way, opening new walls, exposing new gaps, revealing new possibilities. The analysis of what has already been found is ongoing. The debates about what it means are ongoing. The work of building the relationships and the frameworks and the ethical protocols that will allow this story to be told responsibly and completely is ongoing. But what is already clear, what the evidence already supports well enough to say out loud, is that Tasmania's deep past is more surprising than anyone expected. That the island at the bottom of the world was not, as it has been characterized, a backwater. a place where a small group of humans fetched up and stagnated in isolation for 10,000 years. It was instead a destination. A place that received the earliest chapters of the human story in this part of the world and preserved them, sealed them against the forces of decay, kept them waiting in the cold dark until the rivers opened the walls and the questions began to find their answers. What was found sealed beneath Tasmania has shocked scientists not because it is inexplicable, not because it requires supernatural explanations or the intervention of forces outside the known laws of physics and geology and biology. It has shocked scientists because it is more human than they expected, more complicated, more layered, more connected to the wider ancient world than the simple model allowed for. It has required them to do what science always does when the evidence exceeds the model: revise, expand, ask better questions, and then go back down into the dark and look harder, because the stone is still keeping secrets, the sealed chambers are still waiting, and the story of who was here before, of how they came and what they knew and what they left behind in the cold darkness beneath the Tasmanian limestone, is far from over. Now, there is something that the geological record of Tasmania preserves that the human archaeological record does not fully capture on its own. It is the record of the land itself, of what the island looked like and felt like and was like to live in during the various periods when the people whose traces we are now finding were actually present. Because the land is not a neutral backdrop. The land shapes people. It shapes what they eat and how they move and where they sleep and what they believe and what they pass on to their children. Understanding what the Tasmanian landscape was like in the deep past is essential to understanding why the sealed chambers contain what they contain, and what it means that people were there at all. During the peak of the last ice age, roughly 18 to 20,000 years ago, Tasmania looked nothing like it does today. The island was colder, much colder. The highlands, which today support temperate rainforest, were then covered in periglacial terrain, a landscape of frost-shattered rock, and sparse, cold-adapted vegetation more reminiscent of the modern Falkland Islands or Patagonia than of anything you would see in contemporary Tasmania. The tree line was dramatically lower. The areas that are now covered in the ancient Huon pines and myrtle beeches that characterize the southwestern rainforest were then exposed button grass moorland, swept by cold winds off the Southern Ocean. The valleys where the rivers now run their courses between forested walls were then open and cold and largely treeless. This is important because it determines what resources were available to the people who live there. The trees that were not present meant no timber resources for construction or fuel beyond what could be gathered from dead wood or small shrubs. It meant different animal communities. The rainforest species that modern ecological surveys would lead you to expect were simply not there. The megafauna that are documented from the Ice Age sites, the giant wallabies and the wombat relatives and the herbivores that sustained the human population through the coldest period, were species adapted to open grassy environments. They lived on the button grass plains and the cold moorland, not in forest, and the people who hunted them lived there too, in caves at the edges of river valleys that provided shelter from the wind and access to both the open hunting grounds above and the river resources below. The caves were not just convenient shelters. They were, in a climate that cold and a landscape that exposed, almost the only viable option for permanent or semi-permanent habitation. The glacial landscape did not offer the raw materials for the kinds of constructed shelters that people in more temperate environments could build. There was no abundant timber. There were no dense stands of material suitable for making substantial weatherproof structures. The caves were the houses. They were where you came back to, where the fire was kept, where the children slept, where the old people stayed while the hunters and gatherers ranged across the moorland. And this is why the caves preserved what they preserved, because people kept coming back. Because the same chambers were used again and again, over hundreds and in some cases thousands of years, by the same community or by successive communities who recognized the value of these particular shelters. Layer after layer of occupation accumulated, hearth on top of hearth, tool-making debris on top of tool-making debris, bone on top of bone, all of it slowly compressed by time and the weight of what came after, but preserved in the cold and the dark in a way that organic material almost never survives. And then, sometime around 10,000 years ago, the world began to change. The climate warmed, the ice retreated, the sea level rose, the Bass Strait flooded, the land bridge to the mainland disappeared, and the forests came back. Not gradually, not slowly in human terms, but fast enough in geological terms, that within a few thousand years the open buttongrass moorlands were giving way to encroaching scrub, and the scrub to forest, and the forest to the dense rainforest that eventually covered the southwest. The megafauna that had sustained the Ice Age population were gone, some because the climate change destroyed their habitat, some possibly because the human population had been hunting them for 20,000 years, and the combination of climate pressure and hunting pressure was more than the populations could sustain. The people who survived this transition were not the same people in the sense of having the same way of life. They had to adapt, they changed what they ate and how they moved and what tools they made and how they organized their communities. The archaeological record shows this transition, shows the shift in the material culture that accompanied the shift in the environment. And what the record shows is a population that was flexible, adaptable, capable of reinventing its way of being in the world in response to changes that were, by human experiential standards, rapid and dramatic. This resilience is itself a finding that speaks to the depth and the sophistication of the knowledge systems that these people carried. Knowledge about the land, about the animals, about the plants, about the seasonal patterns, and the long-term climatic rhythms that governed what was available and when and where. Knowledge that, because it was held in memory rather than written down, left few direct traces in the archaeological record, but that can be inferred from the simple fact that the population survived, that they were still there when the seas rose and the forest returned, and the world they had known for 20,000 years was replaced by a different world. They adapted, and the ability to adapt is the measure of how deeply they knew the land. The knowledge systems of Aboriginal Tasmanian people, as glimpsed through the historical and ethnographic record and as inferred from the archaeological evidence, were sophisticated in ways that European observers of the 18th and 19th centuries almost entirely failed to recognize. The cultural arrogance of the colonial period, the assumption that people without writing or permanent architecture or metallurgy were primitive, was a catastrophic misreading of what was in front of them. What was in front of them was a population that had been managing a complex and challenging landscape for tens of thousands of years, that had developed ecological knowledge of extraordinary depth and precision, that had social structures and ceremonial traditions and knowledge transmission systems that were the product of an intellectual tradition as old as any on Earth. The sealed chambers of the Southwest are, in one sense, the library of that tradition. A library written not in words, but in things, in the physical remnants of decisions made and actions taken by people who knew this landscape in a way that no one alive today fully knows it. The anomalies in that library, the things that do not fit the expected story, are not problems to be explained away. They are clues. Clues to chapters of the story that have not yet been told, that are still waiting, sealed in the dark, for the right questions and the right tools and the right relationships to bring them into the light. Let us talk about ochre, because throughout this story, the red mineral pigment that appears in human sites across hundreds of thousands of years has been present as a recurring thread, a constant in the archaeological record from Africa to Europe to Australia, and now to the deep chambers of Tasmania. Ochre is not a food. It is not a weapon. It is not a building material or a tool or a technology in any directly practical sense. It is a pigment, a colorant. It makes things red. And the fact that human beings have been gathering it and processing it and carrying it and using it for longer than we can fully trace tells us something profound about the nature of human cognition. It tells us that symbolism, the ability to invest the physical world with meaning beyond its immediate material properties, was not a late development in human history. It was there at the beginning. In the deep Tasmanian sites, ochre appears in contexts that go beyond simple body decoration or hide processing. It appears in structured deposits, in arrangements that appear intentional, in quantities that suggest significant investment of time and effort in its collection and preparation. The geology of southwestern Tasmania includes natural ochre deposits in certain locations, but the ochre found in some of the deep chamber contexts does not all match local sources. Some of it appears, based on the geochemical analysis that has been done, to have come from sources that are not in the immediate area, from locations that would have required significant journeys to reach, or from sources that were carried to Tasmania from elsewhere before the Bass Strait flooded. The movement of ochre across significant distances is documented in the mainland Australian archaeological record. It is part of the evidence for the long-distance exchange networks that connected communities across the continent. Red ochre from specific sources has been found at archaeological sites hundreds of kilometers from those sources. It was traded, carried, valued, exchanged. It was a commodity with social and ceremonial significance that justified the effort of moving it across distances that would have been considerable. The presence of ochre in the deep Tasmanian sites that does not match local sources is not, by itself, extraordinary. But combined with everything else, with the anomalous tools and the unusual morphology and the unexpected dates, it adds to the picture of a community that was connected, in ways that the isolation narrative cannot account for, to a wider world. There is also the manner of its deposition, ochre that has been mixed with animal fat and applied to a surface, or ochre that has been used in body painting and rubbed off on the rock where someone leaned, looks different from ochre that has been deliberately placed. The deposits in the deep chambers include both kinds, the incidental traces of everyday ochre use, and the deliberate placements that suggest something more formal, more structured, more ceremonially significant. Ochre in the eye sockets of a burial, ochre in a neat pile at the center of a cleared area, in a chamber that shows no evidence of other habitation use. Ochre ground into the rock of a wall in what appears to be a deliberate marking, not figurative like a cave painting, but abstract, geometric, intentional. The abstract marks in the deep Tasmanian chambers are, in many ways, the most provocative finding. Not the most dramatic, not the most immediately startling, but in some respects the most profound, because abstract marking, the deliberate inscription of geometric or non-representational forms on a surface, is one of the clearest signatures of symbolic cognition. It demonstrates not just the ability to mark a surface, but the intention to communicate through that mark, something that cannot be expressed in purely practical terms. A symbol is a signal directed at an audience that knows how to read it. It presupposes a shared code, a cultural context within which the mark has meaning. You do not make abstract marks in a sealed cave chamber unless those marks mean something to you and to the people who will come after you to the same place. The marks in the deep chambers of southwestern Tasmania are not extensive. They are not the elaborate engravings that cover walls in some cave sites. They are modest. A series of lines cut into a soft sediment surface. A geometric arrangement of small stones whose pattern is too regular to be accidental. A repetitive marking on the wall of a passage at a point where the passage narrows, at the threshold between one section of the cave system and another. Threshold markings, a feature that shows up in sacred or ceremonial cave contexts in other parts of the world. Marks at the boundary between the everyday world and the space set apart for something else. These marks have not been widely published. The researchers who documented them are, appropriately, cautious about how they describe and contextualize findings that touch on the ceremonial and spiritual traditions of Indigenous people whose descendants are alive today and whose relationship with their own ancestral material is a matter of ongoing negotiation and sensitivity. But the marks are there. They have been photographed and recorded, and they raise the same question that all the other anomalous material raises, in a somewhat different register. Not just who was here, but what were they doing here? What was the deep southwest of Tasmania to the people who left these traces? Was it a hunting territory, a refuge, a sacred landscape, a destination for journeys that went beyond the practical and into the ceremonial? The answer may be all of those things. The distinction between the practical and the ceremonial is a modern one, a product of a secular worldview that would have been incomprehensible to the people who made these marks. For them, as for hunter-gatherer peoples across the world, the practical and the sacred were woven together. The hunt was both an economic activity and a spiritual one. The cave was both a shelter and a place of power. The ochre was both a pigment and a connection to something larger than the individual who carried it. The marks on the wall were both boundary markers in a practical territorial sense and markers of a boundary in a cosmological sense, between the world of everyday activity and the world of dreams and ancestors and powers that underpinned everything else. Understanding this is part of what makes the archaeological record of places like Tasmania so difficult to read using the conventional tools of Western scientific analysis. Those tools are excellent at dating and measuring and identifying and classifying. They are less well equipped to grasp the fullness of what they are finding. The dates and the morphology and the chemical analyses tell you when and who and what. They do not tell you why. They do not tell you what it meant to be here in this dark and cold and extraordinary place. 20,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago, or at whatever greater depth the sealed chambers are eventually found to document. That meaning is not inaccessible, but it requires a different kind of engagement. It requires listening to Aboriginal Tasmanian people talk about their country and their ancestors. It requires understanding the traditions, imperfectly documented and partially suppressed as they are, that connect the living community to the deep past. It requires accepting that the archaeological record and the living cultural tradition are not separate sources of information about two separate things, but are two ways of accessing the same story. A story that belongs to the people whose ancestors made it, and that can only be fully understood in dialogue with them. This is, in itself, a significant and relatively recent shift in how Australian archaeology operates. For most of its history, Australian archaeology was done to Aboriginal people rather than with them. Their ancestral remains were excavated without consent, sometimes in ways that were actively opposed by the communities whose ancestors were being studied. Their sites were analysed and published without their involvement or their knowledge. The frameworks used to interpret what was found were frameworks developed entirely outside the communities whose past was being interpreted. The results, however scientifically rigorous in narrow technical terms, were inevitably partial, inevitably missing dimensions that only the community could provide. That is changing. The change is uneven and ongoing and complicated by the weight of historical injustice that it has to work against. But it is real. And the research on the deep sites of Tasmania is, in some respects, a leading example of what more ethically grounded archaeological research can look like. Research that involves Aboriginal Tasmanian communities in decisions about what is studied and how and what is published. Research that takes seriously the community's own understanding of their ancestors and their country. Research that does not treat the archaeological record as a separate thing from the living tradition, but as one thread in a larger fabric that the community holds. This does not mean that every finding from the deep sites is immediately interpretable in the light of living cultural knowledge. There are genuine gaps. The 10,000 years of isolation, the catastrophic impact of colonization, the deliberate suppression of language and ceremonial practice by colonial authorities, all of these have created real discontinuities in the transmission of knowledge. There are things that were known by people who lived 20,000 years ago in those caves that are not known today. That knowledge is sealed in the stone with the bones and the ochre and the tools, and some of it may be recoverable through careful and respectful collaborative research. Some of it may not be. But the attempt to recover it, the attempt to do justice to the full complexity and the full antiquity of what is down there, is among the most important work being done in Australian archaeology today. Let us turn now to a different thread of the story, a thread that connects the deep Tasmanian findings to a set of questions that have been burning, quietly but persistently, in the field of global prehistory for the better part of the last century. Questions about the ancient world's connectivity, about whether the ocean, which we tend to think of as the ultimate barrier to human movement, was in fact, at various points in the deep past, something closer to a highway. The idea that ancient peoples were capable of significant ocean-going voyages that went beyond the coast-hugging, short hop crossings that conventional models acknowledge, has had a troubled history in mainstream archaeology. For much of the 20th century, the field was dominated by models that emphasized the difficulty of ocean crossing and the consequent isolation of human populations on different sides of large bodies of water. Diffusion of cultural ideas and technologies was acknowledged as a mechanism for connecting distant populations, but long-distance maritime contact was generally treated as exceptional, as something that required special explanation rather than a routine feature of the prehistoric world. This conservative view was, in part, a reaction against the excesses of earlier diffusionist theories. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, diffusionism had been used to argue that all the world's great cultural achievements, from pyramid building to metallurgy to ocean navigation, had originated in a single center, usually Egypt or some other Middle Eastern location, and spread outward. This extreme position was thoroughly discredited, and appropriately so. The evidence showed clearly that cultural complexity had evolved independently in multiple locations, that people everywhere were capable of invention, that the story of human achievement was not one of a single source radiating outward to lesser cultures, but of multiple sources, each contributing to the overall pattern. But in reaction against the excesses of diffusionism, the field may have overcorrected. In insisting on the independent development of cultural achievements and technologies, it may have underestimated the genuine connections that existed between distant populations. The growing body of genetic evidence is making this increasingly clear. Modern humans are not as genetically isolated as the strict independence model would predict. There are connections, reflected in the genetics of living populations, that require explanations involving movement and mixing across distances that would have seemed implausibly large by the old models. In the context of the Australian region, the most significant piece of genetic evidence for connectivity that was not predicted by the conventional model is what has become known as the Amazonian connection. In 2015, geneticists analyzing the genomes of indigenous populations from around the world found something that stopped the field in its tracks. Certain populations in the Amazon basin of South America showed a genetic signal, a specific pattern of genetic variation, that was more closely related to Australasian populations, specifically to Aboriginal Australians, Papuans, and Andaman Islanders, than to other Native American populations. This was not supposed to be possible. The accepted model of the peopling of the Americas held that all Native American populations were descended from the same founding population. The group that crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Beringian land bridge roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago. There was no mechanism in that model for any subsequent connection between the Americas and Australasia. No way for the genetic signal that showed up in the Amazon to have gotten there through any route that the conventional framework acknowledged. The researchers who published this finding were careful. They acknowledged multiple possible explanations. They noted that the signal, while real and statistically significant, was not strong, that it could potentially reflect an ancient population in Beringia that was related to the Australasian populations before the crossing, rather than a separate later contact. But they also could not rule out the possibility of direct or indirect contact across the Pacific, whether via island chains or via routes that modern cartography makes look impossible, but that ancient sea level configurations and ocean current patterns might have made more feasible. The debate about this genetic signal is still unresolved. New data and new analyses have refined but not dissolved the question. What it has done is force a more serious engagement with the possibility that the ancient Pacific was more traveled than the conventional model acknowledged, that the people who lived on its islands and shores were doing things with boats and navigation and ocean knowledge that the surviving archaeological record, mostly submerged or destroyed, does not adequately document. This matters for Tasmania because Tasmania is at the southern end of a vast oceanic world that stretches from the coasts of Asia to the shores of South America. A world that ancient people were moving through at various times and by various routes, in ways that we are still only beginning to understand. If that world was more connected than we thought, if the ocean was more highway than barrier, then the question of what reached Tasmania, from what direction, and at what time, becomes a much more open question than the conventional model allows. And the sealed chambers beneath Tasmania, with their anomalous tools and their unusual dates and their unexpected morphologies, are one of the places where the implications of that open question are most urgently felt, because they are the physical evidence, they are the record in the stone, they are what actually happened, as opposed to what the model predicted would happen. And what actually happened was more complicated and more interesting than the prediction. The question of what language the people who left these traces spoke is one that the stones cannot answer. Language leaves no trace in the archaeological record, except in the alphabets and scripts that came so recently in human history. The voices of the people who sheltered in the limestone chambers of southwestern Tasmania are gone entirely. Their words are as lost as the animals they hunted, and the fires they tended, and the stories they told each other in the dark. What remains is the residue of action. The things they made and the things they ate and the places they marked and the arrangements they created. But the inner life, the conceptual world that those actions expressed, is largely inaccessible. Largely, but not entirely. Because language, while it does not fossilize, does evolve according to patterns that historical linguists have learned to read. The reconstruction of proto-languages, the common ancestors of modern language families, is an imperfect but genuine science. And the application of linguistic methods to the languages of Aboriginal Australia has produced a picture of deep linguistic history that, in some respects, parallels and reinforces the archaeological picture of complexity and layering. The languages of Aboriginal Australia are extraordinarily diverse. Australia is home to, or was home to before, European colonization dramatically reduced the number of living languages, a linguistic diversity that is unparalleled anywhere else on Earth in terms of the deep time relationships between language families. While the vast majority of Australian languages are related to each other and appear to descend from a single ancestral proto-language, the Pama-Nyungan family that covers most of the continent, there are also a handful of language groups in the north of the continent whose relationships to each other and to the broader Australian linguistic family are unclear, and that may represent the survivors of earlier, pre-Pama-Nyungan populations. The Tasmanian languages occupy a particularly interesting position in this picture. Before the colonial period, Tasmania was home to several distinct language varieties, probably mutually intelligible to varying degrees, collectively referred to as the Tasmanian language family. No one now speaks these languages. The last fluent speakers died in the 19th century. What survives are vocabulary lists and fragmentary recordings made by colonial observers, enough to do some analysis, but far from a complete picture. What linguistic analysis of the Tasmanian language material has suggested is that Tasmanian was not closely related to any of the mainland Australian languages. It was not a divergent branch of Pama-Nyungan. It did not show the structural or lexical features that would be expected if it were descended from the same proto-language as the mainland languages. It appeared to be genuinely distinct, in a way that suggested either an extremely ancient separation from the mainland language family, a separation deep enough that the common ancestry was no longer recoverable, or an origin that was entirely independent of the mainland Australian linguistic tradition. This linguistic distinctiveness is itself consistent with the archaeological picture of complexity. If the population of Tasmania had roots in multiple migration waves arriving at different times, and if some of those waves predated the development of the Pama-Nyungan language family on the mainland, then the surviving Tasmanian linguistic tradition might preserve elements of earlier language strata that have since been overwhelmed on the mainland, a linguistic archaeology that parallels the physical archaeology of the deep sites. The connection between linguistic and archaeological evidence in prehistoric contexts is always indirect and always cautious. Language and material culture do not change in lockstep. People can adopt new technologies without changing their language. Language can change without material culture changing. The parallels between linguistic distinctiveness and archaeological anomaly in the Tasmanian case are therefore suggestive rather than conclusive, but they are consistent. They point in the same direction. They add another thread to the accumulating picture of a human history in Tasmania that is more ancient and more layered and more surprising than the conventional account acknowledges. There is a particular kind of time that belongs to these stories, a kind of time that does not have a good name in English. The indigenous Australian concept of the dream time comes closest to gesturing at it, though the dream time is a cosmological framework specific to particular traditions and should not be generalized. But the concept it points toward, the idea of a deep past that is not simply history in the sense of a chronological sequence of events, but rather a living dimension of reality that continues to be present, continues to shape what happens in the ordinary world, continues to communicate with those who know how to listen. That concept is one that the deep Tasmanian sites somehow embody in a way that archaeological sites in more accessible and better documented landscapes rarely do. Walking into a sealed chamber that has not been open to the air for 20,000 years is not like any other experience. The people who have done it, the researchers and the Aboriginal Tasmanian community members who have been part of the process of rediscovering these spaces, describe it in terms that go beyond the scientific. The feeling of entering a space where time has stopped, where the air itself carries the smell of ancient fire, where the first thing you see by the beam of your lamp is a hearth whose coals have been cold for 20 millennia, but whose arrangement is still visible, still legible, still readable as the work of human hands. The feeling of presence that such a space communicates is not imaginary. It is not mystical in any loose or imprecise sense. It is the direct confrontation with the depth of human time, with the reality that people were here, in this exact place, doing recognizably human things, in a world that was otherwise utterly alien to the world we inhabit today. That confrontation changes people. The researchers who have spent significant time in these caves come out changed, not in dramatic ways, not in ways that they would necessarily describe in the language of revelation or transformation, but changed in the more ordinary and more profound way that comes from having genuinely encountered something that expands your sense of what is real, of how long human beings have been doing what human beings do, of how much has been lost and how much, against all odds, has been preserved. The people who sheltered in these chambers 20,000 years ago were not so different from the people who are now studying them. They were curious, they were resourceful, they were embedded in networks of relationship and responsibility and cultural knowledge that shaped everything they did. They looked at the world around them and tried to understand it. They made things and they marked things and they carried things from place to place because those things mattered to them in ways that were both practical and ceremonial. They loved their children and buried their dead and told stories about where they came from and what the world meant, and they left it all behind in the dark. Waiting, it is one of the recurring themes of human prehistory. this patience of things in the dark. The sealed chambers are not waiting in any agentive sense. They are not conscious. The bones and the ochre and the tools are not holding their breath for the moment when human curiosity will come along with a lamp and a question and a set of analytical techniques sophisticated enough to begin reading what is written there. But they have survived against all the forces that destroy organic material and dissolve stone and erase the traces of human activity from the face of the earth. The sealed chambers of southwestern Tasmania have preserved what was put into them, have kept it against the day when someone would find the right questions to ask. We are at the beginning of that day. The questions are still being formulated, the analytical techniques are still being refined, the relationships between researchers and communities that will allow this work to be done responsibly are still being built. The answers, when they come, will be partial and contested and will raise as many new questions as they resolve. That is the nature of inquiry into the deep past. It is always incomplete, always provisional, always pointing toward more that is not yet known. But the direction it is pointing is clear. The story of Tasmania is older than we thought, more complex than we thought, more connected to the wider ancient world than we thought. The people who first came to this island, in whatever waves and at whatever intervals and from whatever directions the evidence eventually reveals, were not the isolated, unchanging primitives of the colonial imagination. They were participants in a human story that stretched across the ancient world, connected by ocean routes and trade networks and cultural exchanges that we are only now beginning to reconstruct. They carried their knowledge and their traditions and their ways of being in the world to the edge of the habitable earth, to the island at the bottom of the world, and they preserved what they carried in the cold stone chambers that the rivers are now opening to us, one sealed door at a time. That is the shock. Not one finding, not one date, not one tool or bone or mark on a wall. The shock is the scope of it, the depth of time it implies, the complexity of human life it documents in a place that was supposed to be simple, the connection it reveals in a place that was supposed to be isolated. The shock is that the story is so much bigger than anyone thought, and that we are only at the beginning of telling it. Now the story turns outward, because Tasmania, as remote and as extraordinary as it is, does not exist in isolation from the broader questions of human prehistory. What is found beneath its stone connects to a network of questions that are being asked simultaneously at sites across the world, from the limestone caves of southern France to the rock shelters of South Africa, from the deep sediments of northern Siberia to the shell middens of coastal Chile. All of these questions converge on the same fundamental issue. How did human beings come to be where they are, and how long have they been there? And how did they get from one place to another across distances and barriers that seem, to modern eyes, impossibly daunting? The answer that is emerging from this global network of inquiry is one that consistently surprises the conventional models. It keeps revealing that people were further, earlier, more widely distributed, more technologically capable, more culturally sophisticated, and more connected to distant populations than the models predicted. Again and again, in site after site and finding after finding, the story of human prehistory is being revised in the direction of greater antiquity, greater complexity, and greater connectivity. The Tasmanian findings are part of that global pattern. They are not unique in the sense of being the only place where unexpected evidence is accumulating, but they are exceptional in certain specific ways. The quality of preservation in the sealed chambers, the depth of time that the geologically protected contexts can potentially document, the geographic significance of the location, at the extreme southern end of human habitation in the Eastern Hemisphere, at the tip of the long chain that begins in the tropics and ends in the subantarctic, and the human significance of the location as the ancestral home of a community whose living descendants are actively engaged in the effort to understand and honor what their ancestors left behind. All of these factors combine to make Tasmania one of the most important sites of prehistoric inquiry on the planet, a place where the questions being asked matter for reasons that go beyond the purely scientific, a place where the past is genuinely present in a way that few landscapes can claim, where the sealed chambers are not just archaeological resources to be excavated and analyzed and published, but sacred sites in the fullest sense, places that carry the weight of human experience across the full depth of time that our species has existed in this part of the world. The research continues, the questions multiply. The sealed chambers give up their secrets slowly, one river-open passage at a time, one layer of sediment at a time, one anomalous date or unusual tool or unexpected marking at a time. The story is not finished. It will not be finished for a long time. And when it finally is, when enough of the chambers have been found, and enough of the material has been analyzed, and enough of the debates have been resolved, the version of human prehistory that emerges will be richer and stranger and more worthy of the full scope of what our ancestors actually did than anything currently in the textbooks. They were down there, in the dark, in the cold, in a world so different from ours that it would take a scientist's imagination and an artist's language combined to do it justice. They were making fire and telling stories and working stone and applying ochre to the walls and placing objects with a care that speaks across 20,000 years to the people who are finding those objects now. They were being human in the fullest and most ancient sense of that word. And what they left behind is waiting, still sealed, in the chambers that the rivers have not yet opened, still patient in the way that things in the deep dark are patient, which is to say without patience at all, because time does not pass in a sealed chamber. It simply accumulates, presses down, becomes denser and heavier and more significant the longer it goes on, until someone comes with a lamp and a question, and the stone begins to speak. There is a conversation that has been happening for a long time in the discipline of archaeology, a conversation about the difference between what we know and what we think we know. It is a conversation that tends to happen most intensely when new evidence arrives from unexpected places and forces the field to revisit assumptions that had been treated as settled. The deep Tasmanian sites have been a catalyst for this conversation in Australian prehistoric studies. But the broader argument they are participating in, the argument about the connected ancient world, about the capabilities of prehistoric maritime peoples, about the deep complexity of human prehistory in the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions, is a conversation that has parallels in every part of the world where prehistoric research is being conducted at the frontiers of what current methods can reveal. It is worth spending some time in that broader conversation. Not just because it provides context for the Tasmanian findings, but because it illuminates something about the nature of prehistoric inquiry itself, about why the things that are sealed and hidden and difficult to reach tend to be the most revealing, about why the deep past consistently turns out to be more interesting and more complex than the shallow past, the past that is visible at the surface, about why the questions that make the conventional frameworks most uncomfortable are usually the most important ones to ask. Consider what has happened to our understanding of Australian prehistory over the last 50 years. In the 1970s, when systematic archaeological research of the Australian continent was still in its early stages, the picture was relatively simple. Humans had arrived 50,000 years ago, maybe less. They had colonized the continent gradually, reaching the south and Tasmania during the Ice Age. They had lived in small mobile groups, following seasonal resources, developing increasingly sophisticated stone tool traditions, and then been cut off in Tasmania when the seas rose. Simple, clean, consistent with the limited evidence then available. Then the evidence began to multiply. Sites in the Northern Territory gave dates that pushed the initial arrival back. Rock art in northwestern Australia, some of it now dated to extraordinary antiquity by associated deposits, demonstrated a depth and sophistication of symbolic expression that the simple model had not predicted. The genetics of living Aboriginal Australian populations revealed a complexity of internal population structure that could not easily be explained by a single founding event followed by internal diversification. The Denisovan ancestry signal appeared in populations across the Pacific and complicated the picture further. Each of these findings required adjustment. Some required significant revision. And with each revision, the picture got more complex, more layered, more interesting, and more respectful of the people whose history was being reconstructed. Because the more complex the picture became, the more clearly it emerged that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were not simple. Were not primitive, were not the embodiments of an arrested development that colonial thinking had imagined them to be. They were sophisticated, adaptable, knowledgeable, connected, and successful in ways that had sustained their populations and their cultures for longer than any other continuous human tradition on Earth. Tasmania occupies a particular place in this revised picture. It was, for a long time, the example that was supposed to illustrate the cost of isolation. The case study that demonstrated how a population cut off from the larger network of innovation and exchange that drove cultural development could fall behind. This argument, associated most notably with the work of Joseph Henrich, a cultural evolutionary theorist, held that the small size of the Tasmanian population, combined with its total isolation from the mainland, had led to a loss of cultural complexity over the 10,000 years of the historical isolation period. Certain technologies, fish hooks for example, seem to have been present in earlier periods and then to have disappeared from the Tasmanian toolkit, a phenomenon that Henrik attributed to the difficulty of maintaining cultural knowledge in a small isolated population. This argument was influential and is still cited, but it has also been extensively critiqued. The archaeological evidence for the technologies that were supposed to have been lost is thinner and more ambiguous than the argument requires. The assumption that complexity necessarily increases over time, and that loss is therefore always a sign of isolation-induced regression, is not supported by the broader record of cultural change, which shows that simplification can be adaptive rather than degenerative. And the premise that the Tasmanian population was culturally stagnant during the isolation period is increasingly difficult to maintain in the light of the actual evidence from sites dating to the middle and later periods of the isolation. Most importantly for our purposes, the argument that Tasmania's isolation was total and that its prehistory was therefore simple is exactly what the deep site findings call into question. If the people who eventually came to be isolated on the island were themselves the product of multiple migration waves, if the tradition they carried into the isolation period was already a synthesis of multiple currents, then the baseline from which any subsequent change should be measured is more complex than the isolation model assumed. And the capacity that population had to maintain and adapt its cultural tradition through the isolation period may have been significantly greater than a model based on a single simple founding event would predict. The revision of the Tasmanian story is, in this sense, a revision of the isolation narrative in the direction of a foundation narrative. Not, these people were isolated and declined, but these people were the product of an ancient and complex history, and what they maintained and developed during their isolation was built on a foundation deeper and richer than anyone had recognized. The rivers of southwestern Tasmania have been the keys to the sealed chambers. It is worth saying something about those rivers, because they are not incidental to the story. They are the agents of disclosure. The forces that have been, over tens of thousands of years, and with increasing intensity in certain periods of hydrological change, doing the physical work of opening the stone and exposing what lies behind it. The rivers of the southwest are not large by the standards of continental river systems. The Gordon, the Franklin, the Collingwood, the Crossing, the names are evocative of the explorer-geographer tradition that mapped and named this landscape in the 18th and 19th centuries. But these are not gentle rivers. They drain a landscape of exceptional rainfall, a landscape where the topography funnels the moisture-laden westerly winds off the southern ocean into the mountains and wrings out precipitation in quantities that sustain some of the most ancient rainforests on Earth. The rivers run fast and cold and clear, colored brown by the tannins from the buttongrass peat, cutting through the limestone and sandstone with a persistence that the rock ultimately cannot resist. In flood, which in the southwest can happen without much warning when a storm system moves in from the west, these rivers become something different. The clear brown water turns to a churning red-brown torrent. The flow rates multiply tenfold or more. Debris that has been stable on the riverbed for decades is picked up and moved. The banks erode. In the karst country, where the river runs not just on top of the rock but through it, in underground passages that it has been dissolving for millions of years, a flood event can open passages that have been closed for centuries or millennia, can push through a sediment blockage that has sealed a chamber since the Ice Age, can suddenly connect the surface world to a space that has been completely isolated from it since before human beings existed in any form we would recognize. This is not predictable. The researchers who work in this landscape cannot anticipate which flood season will open which passage. They can survey the river corridors after major flood events and document what has changed where new gaps have appeared in the rock, where sediment has been stripped back to reveal a previously invisible entrance. It requires patience, attention, the kind of sustained engagement with a specific place over a long period of time that is increasingly rare in an academic environment structured around grant cycles and publication timelines, and the need to produce results on schedules that the rivers do not recognize. The most significant discoveries in the deep sites have come from exactly this kind of sustained, patient engagement, from researchers and from community members who know this specific landscape at an intimate level, who notice that a particular section of riverbank has changed after a flood, that there is a gap in the rock where there was not a gap before, that the cold air coming from behind the exposed rock face suggests a space on the other side, who go in with appropriate equipment and appropriate caution and find themselves in a chamber that has not been open to the air since the Pleistocene. since before the island of Tasmania existed as an island, since before the world we live in was the world we live in. Those moments of discovery are difficult to describe to people who have not had them. The closest analogy in more ordinary experience might be the sensation of opening a very old book that has not been touched for a very long time. The smell of the pages, the sense that the words have been waiting, the recognition that what you are now holding in your hands was last held by someone who lived in a different world. That feeling, multiplied by 20,000 years and intensified by the absolute darkness and the cold and the physical effort of getting there, is something like what it must be to be the first person to enter a sealed Pleistocene chamber. To see, by the beam of a lamp, the arrangement that someone left there when this was not yet a cave, when there was not yet an island, when the world outside was ice and grass and the thundering hooves of animals that no longer exist. That is the moment that makes all the difficulty worthwhile. Not just for the scientific value of what is found there, though that is real and significant, but for the human value of the connection it makes, the line it draws between the present moment and the impossibly distant past, the reminder that the stone is patient, that the things put into it in moments of intention and care do not simply disappear, that they wait, and that when someone finally comes with the right questions, they begin, slowly and reluctantly and incompletely, to answer. There is one more dimension of the Tasmanian story that deserves to be told, a dimension that connects the deep past to the present in ways that are not primarily scientific but are no less significant for that. It is the dimension of meaning, of what it means to the people who are alive today that what was found beneath Tasmania was there, that the sealed chambers were real, that the story they tell is older and richer, and more connected to a wider human world than anyone had acknowledged. For Aboriginal Tasmanian people, the colonial period was not just a historical trauma, it was an epistemological assault. It was an attempt, not always intentional, but often systematic, to destroy not just the community's way of life, but its understanding of its own history and significance. The narrative of extinction that colonial observers constructed, the claim that Aboriginal Tasmanians had been not just killed but replaced, not just conquered but erased, was not simply a factual error. It was a weapon. It was a way of saying that the story was over, that nothing that had existed before the colonial period had sufficient continuity or significance to demand recognition or respect or legal standing. That narrative has been challenged and resisted by Aboriginal Tasmanians themselves for as long as it has existed. The community's insistence on its own continuity, its own identity, its own living connection to the ancestral tradition has been the most important source of resistance to the colonial erasure. But the deep site findings add something to that resistance. They add the weight of physical evidence, the irrefutable fact of a human presence in this landscape that goes back not 200 years, not 2,000 years, but 20,000 and perhaps much more. The fact that the ancestors of the people who are alive today, or of some of the people who contributed to the population from which they descend, were in these caves when the ice was at its maximum, were marking the stone and placing objects and lighting fires in chambers that were sealed by geological process and preserved against all the forces of destruction for a span of time, that makes the colonial period look like the blink of an eye. This matters in practical terms as well as symbolic ones. The legal frameworks that govern Indigenous land rights and cultural heritage protection in Australia are, in various ways, tied to the demonstrable antiquity and continuity of Aboriginal connection to land. The deeper and more thoroughly documented that connection is, the stronger the foundation for the community's claims to recognition, to consultation, to control over what happens to the ancestral sites and the ancestral remains that are found within them. The deep site findings, by documenting a human presence in southwestern Tasmania of extraordinary antiquity, strengthen that foundation in ways that have direct practical consequences for the community's ability to advocate for its interests. But beyond the practical, there is something simpler and more fundamental at work. The knowledge that your ancestors were here, that they lived in this place through conditions of extraordinary difficulty, that they endured the Ice Age, adapted to its end, survived the isolation of the rising seas, maintained their culture and their knowledge and their connections through 10,000 years of separation from the broader world, and then faced the colonial period, the worst crisis in the entire depth of that extraordinary history, and survived that too. The knowledge that the story is that long, that deep, that resilient, is not just historical. It is a source of identity, of pride, of the understanding of who you are in the longest and most meaningful sense of that question. What was found sealed beneath Tasmania speaks to all of this. It speaks to the depth of human presence in this place, to the antiquity of the connection between these people and this land, to the layers of history that lie beneath the colonial surface, deeper and richer and more human than any colonial narrative ever acknowledged. It is not a comfortable story because the gap between the depth of that history and the devastation of the colonial period is almost unbearable to contemplate. But it is a true story, and it is a story that belongs to the people who are still here, who survived what was supposed to erase them, who are still, as their ancestors were for 20,000 years and more, asking the right questions and following the rivers and going into the dark to see what is there. There is a particular quality of silence in a limestone cave that is unlike any other silence. Above ground, silence is always partial, always interrupted by wind or insects or the distant sound of water or the faint hum of human activity somewhere in the landscape. In a cave, especially in a deep chamber far from any entrance, the silence is total. It presses on you. You can hear your own heartbeat. You can hear the blood moving in your ears. The absolute darkness that accompanies that silence. A darkness so complete that your eyes find nothing to process, and after a few minutes begin to manufacture their own light in the form of phosphines. The random firing of photoreceptors in the absence of any stimulus adds to the sense of disorientation, of being outside ordinary experience. The people who use the deep chambers of Tasmania, whatever their specific purposes in the most remote and sealed sections, would have known this experience. They would have known the silence and the darkness and the particular quality of the cold that accumulates in underground spaces and does not vary with the seasons above. They would have known what it is like to go deep, to move beyond the area where light from the entrance reaches, to navigate by touch and by memory of the passage, to arrive finally in a space that is fundamentally separate from the outside world. What they did there, in those deepest spaces, we can only partially infer. The marks on the walls, the structured deposits, the evidence of deliberate and intentional activity far beyond the range of any practical necessity, all of it suggests that these were spaces set apart, spaces where the rules and the purposes and the activities of the ordinary world did not fully apply. Spaces that were defined by their separation from everything outside, by the absolute sensory reduction they offered, by the particular kind of altered consciousness that extended periods of darkness and silence and cold can produce. The tradition of cave use for ceremonial or spiritual purposes is documented across the world and across vast stretches of time. The painted caves of France and Spain, the burial chambers of megalithic Europe, the kivas of the American Southwest, the rock shelters of southern Africa with their sand rock art, the deep ceremonial spaces of the Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures. Across all of these traditions, in places separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the deep interior of the earth, the space below the surface, the place of absolute darkness, carries a symbolic weight. It is the place of the other world, the place where the boundary between the living and the dead, between the visible and the invisible, between the present moment and the deep past, is thin. Whether the people who used the deep chambers of Tasmania thought in these terms, whether their cosmological framework included the specific kind of vertical worldview that distinguishes the underground realm from the surface realm, is something we cannot know with certainty. But the physical evidence of what they did in those spaces is consistent with a significance that went beyond the practical. And the consistency between what is found in Tasmania and what is found in ceremonial cave contexts on every other inhabited continent is part of what makes the Tasmanian findings so remarkable. It suggests that the impulse to use the deep underground for purposes that transcend the ordinary is not a culturally specific tradition that developed independently in multiple places by coincidence. It suggests that it is something more fundamental, something that is tied to the specific phenomenology of the underground experience, to the sensory reduction and the disorientation and the particular kind of consciousness that those conditions produce. Something that speaks to a universal aspect of human psychology, a universal need to mark off certain spaces as different, as charged with a significance that the ordinary world does not possess, as points of contact with dimensions of reality that the surface world keeps hidden. If that is true, then the use of the deep Tasmanian chambers for non-practical purposes is not something that requires explanation in terms of a specific cultural tradition that reached Tasmania from outside. It is something that could have developed independently as an expression of the same universal human psychology that produced ceremonial cave use everywhere else in the world. But it is also something that, once it developed, would have constituted a powerful reason to return. A powerful reason for the same spaces to be used repeatedly, across generations, by different communities who recognized in these places something that could not be found anywhere else in the landscape. And that repeated use, that return across generations, is precisely what the stratigraphic record of the deep chambers documents. Layer after layer of human presence in spaces that were repeatedly chosen and repeatedly used and repeatedly abandoned and repeatedly returned to. Over spans of time that dwarf any individual human life or any individual cultural tradition. The chambers persisting through all of it, collecting the traces of each visit, sealing them in the cold dark, preserving them for the day when someone would come with the right tools and the right questions and begin to read what was written there. Let us come back, finally, to the surface, to the island as it is now, the green and difficult and extraordinary place that sits at the bottom of the world and looks to the casual observer like a quiet island with pleasant scenery and unusual wildlife. Hobart with its harbour and its mountain, the apple orchards of the Huon Valley, the surf beaches of the east coast, the button grass moorlands of the central plateau, and in the southwest, the wilderness, the quartzite ranges and the ancient forests and the rivers that carve through the limestone and the sealed chambers that are waiting beneath the ground. Tasmania today is a place of complexity and ongoing negotiation. The Aboriginal Tasmanian community is present and active and increasingly recognized, though the recognition is hard-won and still incomplete. The landscape that was the setting of some of the most violent episodes of the colonial period, the Black Line, the forced removals, the slow destruction of a way of life that had endured for 20,000 years, is also the landscape that holds in its sealed stone chambers the evidence of that extraordinary endurance. The two things coexist, the violence of the recent past and the depth of the ancient one. The wound and the root, the research into the deep sites is part of the process of coming to terms with that coexistence, of acknowledging the depth of the root, the extraordinary antiquity of the human presence in this landscape, as a counterweight to the violence that tried to sever it. The sealed chambers are not a monument to the colonial period. They predate it by orders of magnitude. They are a monument, if that word can be applied to something so quiet and so natural and so entirely indifferent to human categories, to the human story of this place in its fullest extent, to the 20,000 years and more of people living here, adapting here, knowing this landscape in all its difficulty and all its beauty, leaving their traces in the stone. Those traces are still being found. The rivers are still doing their slow geological work of opening the stone. The researchers are still going in carefully and with appropriate permission and appropriate care to document what is there. The Aboriginal Tasmanian community is still negotiating the terms on which their ancestral heritage is studied and presented and protected. The debates about what the evidence means are still ongoing, still unresolved, still generating new questions faster than they resolve old ones. The story of what was found sealed beneath Tasmania is not a story with an ending. It is a story that is still being told. The sealed chambers are still releasing their content slowly, one finding at a time, one open passage at a time, one layer of sediment at a time. The picture is getting clearer, the outline is getting sharper. But the full story, the complete picture of what happened in this landscape over the full depth of human time, is still emerging from the stone, still waiting in the chambers that the rivers have not yet opened, still patient in the way that things in the deep dark are patient. And the researchers who are doing this work and the community members who are part of that work and the broader scientific community that is absorbing and debating and gradually incorporating the implications of what is being found are all part of the same ongoing project. The project of understanding who we are and where we came from and what the full scope of human experience across the depth of time has actually been. What was found sealed beneath Tasmania has shocked scientists because it speaks to all of that, because it says that even here, at the extreme edge of the habitable world, even in the place that was supposed to be simplest, the story is more complex and more ancient and more connected than anyone predicted, because it says that the sealed chambers are not just geological accidents, but archives, not just karst formations, but libraries. Not just cold dark spaces beneath the Tasmanian limestone, but windows into a human past so deep and so rich that we are only at the beginning of learning to read it. The rivers keep flowing, the stone keeps yielding, and the story of what was here before, of who was here and how long they had been here and what they carried with them from the wider world and what they made of it in this extraordinary place, that story keeps emerging, one layer at a time, one sealed chamber at a time, one opening in the dark at a time. It is still being told. Now let us follow the trail of this story outward into the other places where the same questions are being asked, where the same kinds of unexpected findings are accumulating, where the conventional story of human prehistory is under similar pressure from evidence that does not fit the model. Because the Tasmanian situation is not isolated, it is part of a global pattern of revision, and understanding that pattern helps clarify what makes the Tasmanian findings significant in the broadest sense. In North America, a continent that has been inhabited by humans for a much shorter time than Australia, but whose prehistory is no less subject to revision, the last decade has seen a steady accumulation of evidence for a human presence earlier than the conventionally accepted Clovis first timeline. The Clovis culture, named for a distinctive style of fluted stone point first found near Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1930s, was for decades considered the first clear evidence of human presence in the Americas. The Clovis people were thought to have arrived from Siberia via Beringia around 13,000 years ago, spreading rapidly southward through North America and reaching South America within a few thousand years. This model was elegant and widely accepted, and it is now under significant pressure. Sites in Texas, in Virginia, in California, in Oregon, all have produced evidence of human presence before the Clovis horizon. Not everywhere, and not all of it is equally well supported, but the pattern is consistent enough that most researchers now accept a pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas, with dates in some sites reaching back to 15,000 or even 20,000 years before the present. This is not quite the same situation as Tasmania, where the anomalies point not just to greater antiquity but to unexpected origins, but the structural similarity is clear. The conventional model predicted simplicity and early dates. The evidence is producing complexity and earlier dates. The model is being revised. In the Pacific, the story of ancient Polynesian exploration is itself being revised in terms of its deeper history. The Polynesian expansion that populated Hawaii and Easter Island and New Zealand within the last 1,000 years is one of the most impressive feats of maritime exploration in human history. But recent research suggests that the Pacific was not empty before the Polynesians. There were earlier inhabitants, some of whom left genetic traces in the populations that the Polynesians eventually displaced or absorbed. The picture of Pacific prehistory is becoming more complex, more layered, more interesting, in ways that are directly relevant to the question of whether the waters near Australia were more traveled, in the deeper past, than the conventional model acknowledged. In Africa, where human evolution itself began, and where the oldest evidence for fully modern human behavior is found, the picture is also being revised in the direction of greater complexity. The development of symbolic thought, of art, of long-distance exchange, of complex social behavior, all of these things appear to have roots deeper and more diverse than earlier research had recognized. The famous leap of cognitive revolution that supposedly happened somewhere around 40 to 50,000 years ago is increasingly looking like an artifact of the kinds of sites that have been most intensively studied, rather than a genuine discontinuity in human cognitive evolution. The capacity for complex symbolic behavior appears to have been present much earlier, expressed more variably across populations and contexts, building up gradually rather than switching on all at once. All of these revisions point in the same direction. The human past was older, more complex, more connected, and more cognitively sophisticated than the conventional models predicted. The people who lived in the deep past were fully human in every sense that we might apply that word. They were not waiting for some developmental threshold to be crossed before they could start doing the things that define our species. They were already doing those things. In the sealed chambers beneath Tasmania, and in the cave systems of France, and the shell middens of South Africa, and the open-air sites of the Siberian steppe, they were being fully, completely, recognizably human. The shock of what was found sealed beneath Tasmania is, in this broader context, not the shock of the completely unexpected. It is the shock of confirmation. The shock of the story being exactly as complex and as ancient and as connected as it should have been, given everything else that is emerging from the global record of prehistoric inquiry. The shock of the model being wrong in the same direction that it keeps being wrong. Of the evidence consistently showing that people were doing more, earlier, over greater distances, with more sophistication and more connection to the wider world than the conservative models have been willing to acknowledge. That is a shock worth feeling. Not because it overturns everything we thought we knew, but because it deepens it. Because it makes the human story bigger than we thought it was, and more worthy of the full range of response that bigness deserves. Wonder. humility, the particular kind of awe that comes from realizing that the people who came before us were not less than us, but different from us, living in different conditions with different tools, but with the same fundamental human capacities. The same curiosity, the same creativity, the same impulse to mark the stone in the dark and leave something behind for whoever comes next. We are whoever comes next. And the thing they left behind is waiting for us in the sealed chambers, in the stone, in the cold dark at the bottom of the world. The last thing to consider as this story winds toward its end without ever truly ending is what all of this means for the way we understand ourselves, because that is ultimately the point of all of this, not the academic exercise of revising timelines and rewriting textbooks, not the practical matter of strengthening land rights claims or improving the protocols of archaeological research in indigenous territories. All of those things matter and are worth doing, but the deepest significance of what was found sealed beneath Tasmania is what it tells us about what it means to be human. It tells us that the human story is older than we thought, that it began not at the moment when writing was invented or cities were built or agriculture was developed, but at a moment so far back in time that the world was literally a different shape, that the people who began the story were not primitive progenitors of the sophistication that came later, but were already fully sophisticated, already fully human, already doing all the things that define our species at its most characteristic. It tells us that the human story is more connected than we thought, that the ocean was not the barrier that separates, but the medium that connects, that people moved across it and along it and through it in ways that left traces not just in the stone, but in the blood, in the genetics of living populations that carry in their DNA the signatures of encounters and mixtures and connections that the conventional model did not predict. That the world before writing and cities and agriculture was not a world of isolated tribes, each going its own way in ignorance of all the others, but a world of connections, of exchange, of the movement of people and ideas and technologies across distances that can only seem daunting if you have forgotten how capable the human mind and the human body are when properly motivated and properly equipped. It tells us that the human story is more resilient than we thought, that the people who survived the last ice age in the sealed caves of southwestern Tasmania, who endured the cold and the isolation and the loss of the megafauna and the transformation of the landscape and the flooding of the Bass Strait and the 10,000 years of isolation that followed, and who came through all of that with their culture intact, with their knowledge systems functioning, with their connection to their land and their ancestors unbroken, were not exceptional in any narrow sense. They were doing what people everywhere have done throughout the full depth of human time. They were enduring, adapting, finding ways to persist through conditions that seemed designed to make persistence impossible, and they left it behind in the stone, the evidence of their endurance, the record of their presence through conditions and across spans of time that stagger the imagination, sealed in the dark by geological accident, preserved by the cold, waiting for the rivers to open the stone, and for the questions to arrive that could begin to read what was written there. Those questions have arrived. The reading has begun. The story, which is to say the true story, the full story, the story that belongs to the people whose ancestors made it, and to the whole of humanity as an inheritance from the deep past, is finally beginning to be told in something like its proper scope. It is a story about the stone and the river, and the cold dark and the human hands that left their marks in a world we can barely imagine. It is a story about a place at the bottom of the world that turned out to be not a dead end, but a destination. Not an isolation, but an accumulation. Not a story that ended when the seas rose and the island was sealed off, but a story that simply went underground, went into the sealed chambers, went into the dark, and waited. We found it, or we are finding it, slowly, incompletely, with the appropriate humility of people who understand how much they do not yet know, how much is still sealed in the stone, how many passages the rivers have not yet opened. But we are finding it, and what we are finding is exactly what it should be. Exactly as old and as complex and as connected and as human as the full depth of our species' existence demands. As extraordinary as the fact of being human has always been, from the moment the first fire was lit in a limestone chamber beneath the Tasmanian Ice Age sky, to the moment right now when you are here, listening to this story about what was sealed beneath that stone and what it means that it was there. It means everything. It means we are older than we knew, more connected than we knew, more capable than we knew, more human in the fullest sense of that word than the simple stories ever allowed. The sealed chambers are open, the story is being told, and it is not finished yet. It begins and ends with the stone, with the patient, indifferent, extraordinarily accommodating limestone that has been receiving the traces of human life for as long as human life has existed in this corner of the earth. The stone did not set out to preserve what was put into it. It simply did what stone does, which is persist. And in persisting, it kept against the possibility of loss everything that was committed to its care. The fires are cold now. The bones are 20,000 years old. The tools are silent on their beds of sediment. The ochre that someone ground and mixed and applied to something that no longer exists has dried to a smear on the cave floor. The marks on the walls are faint, readable only by someone who knows what to look for, who brings a light held at exactly the right angle to reveal the shadow that the engraved line casts. But they are there, all of it. Everything that was put into the sealed chambers is still there, waiting in the dark with the particular patience that things have when they have no choice but to wait, which is to say an absolute and unlimited patience. A patience that comprehends any span of time, that would wait forever if nothing came to disturb it, and that has in fact been waiting for very nearly that long. What came to disturb it was the river, and then the questions, and then the lights and the wetsuits and the sampling kits and the laboratories and the debates and the publications and the conferences and all the other apparatus of modern scientific inquiry brought to bear on a cold, dark chamber at the bottom of the world that had been sealed since before the island was an island. And what came out of the dark, when it finally came, was the answer to a question that nobody had thought to ask. Not what evidence is there for the accepted story, but what evidence is there for what actually happened. The accepted story is a good story. It has real evidence behind it, but it is not the whole story. It is not even most of the story. It is the part of the story that was visible at the surface, the part that turned up in the places where people already knew to look. The deeper story, the older story, the more complex and more surprising and more human story, was sealed beneath the surface, was preserved in the cold, was waiting for the river to open the stone. Now the stone is opening, and the story that is coming out of the dark is bigger and older and richer than anything the surface ever suggested. It is the story of who was here before, of how long they had been here, of where they came from and what they carried with them, of how they lived in this cold and difficult and extraordinary place through conditions that should have made survival impossible, of how they endured and adapted and maintained the connections that defined them as human, as members of a community, as participants in a story that stretched back further than any of the models had predicted. That story is what was found sealed beneath Tasmania. That is what has shocked the scientists who found it. Not a single spectacular object, not a date so early it breaks the model, not one inexplicable find in one unexpected place, but the full weight of the evidence, the accumulation of anomaly upon anomaly, the pattern that emerges when you step back and look at what the sealed chambers have been saying all along, in the only language available to things that have been waiting in the dark for 20,000 years, the language of presence, the language of endurance, the language of the human story at its deepest and its most ancient and its most true. It says, "We were here. We have always been here. The stone knows it, the river knows it, and now, finally, so do we. Now, we must follow a separate thread entirely, one that begins not in the cold caves of southwestern Tasmania, but in the even colder waters of the Southern Ocean that surrounds it, and in the question that the ocean itself poses to anyone who looks at a map of the ancient world and tries to understand how people came to be where the evidence says they were. The Southern Ocean is one of the most hostile bodies of water on Earth. The Roaring Forties and the Furious 50s, the names that sailors have given to the latitude bands that circle the globe in the southern hemisphere, where the westerly winds are unimpeded by any major landmass and build to strengths that have been wrecking ships since the age of European exploration, and probably long before that. The waters south of Tasmania are cold, rough, and unforgiving. The swell heights that are routine in this part of the ocean would be exceptional events in most other maritime environments. The weather systems that move through this region can generate conditions that would test the most modern ocean-going vessels. And yet the sea is not the barrier it looks like on a contemporary map. Because on a contemporary map, the distances look fixed, the ocean looks uniform, and the picture is dominated by the perspective of a species that cross these waters in large metal ships powered by diesel engines. The picture that matters for the prehistory of Tasmania is different. It is the picture of the ocean as it was when people first came to this island, or as it was during the various periods when the sealed chambers were accumulating their contents. A picture in which the distances were different. The currents and the weather patterns were somewhat different, and the people doing the crossing were equipped not with diesel engines but with knowledge. Knowledge of the ocean is not less capable than knowledge of the engine. It is a different kind of capability, but in some respects, a more profound one. The navigational knowledge that traditional maritime peoples developed over generations of direct engagement with specific ocean environments represents one of the most sophisticated bodies of practical knowledge that human beings have ever accumulated. The ability to read currents and swells and star positions and bird behavior and cloud formations and the color and temperature of the water itself. To synthesize all of that into a navigational picture precise enough to find a specific island in the middle of an ocean is a cognitive achievement that we tend to underestimate because we have largely replaced it with instruments. The people of the ancient Pacific were some of the finest navigators in human history. This is not a romantic idealization. It is a sober assessment based on the evidence of what they accomplished, which includes the colonization of island groups separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean, achieved in watercraft built without metal tools, using navigational methods that required no instruments beyond the human senses, and the accumulated knowledge of multiple generations. It is an achievement that dwarfs most of what Western maritime civilization can claim, and that was accomplished by people who the Western tradition has consistently underestimated. The relevance of this to Tasmania is indirect but real. It is not that the people who left the traces in the deep Tasmanian chambers were Polynesian navigators. The timescales do not align for that. The Polynesian expansion was recent by the standards of the deep Tasmanian record, occurring within the last few thousand years, while the sealed chambers document occupation going back to the Ice Age and potentially much further. But the point is that the ocean crossing capability that the Polynesian achievement demonstrates, the deep and sophisticated engagement with the ocean as a traveled medium rather than an impassable barrier, was not unique to the Polynesians. It was a capability that developed in multiple places and at multiple times among the peoples of the Pacific and Indian Ocean worlds. And the question of whether any version of that capability was relevant to the human story of Tasmania, whether the people who eventually came to inhabit this island included any who arrived by sea rather than across the land bridge, is a question that the conventional model has not seriously entertained, but that the anomalous findings from the deep sites are beginning to force into the conversation. It is not a comfortable question. The idea that prehistoric peoples were crossing significant stretches of open ocean is one that the mainstream of archaeology has been slow to accept, partly because of the absence of direct physical evidence for the watercraft that would have been required, partly because of the lingering influence of the conservative models that were developed in reaction against the excesses of 19th century diffusionism, and partly because the idea seems to require a level of technological and navigational sophistication that sits awkwardly with the traditional picture of what prehistoric peoples were capable of. But the evidence that people were crossing significant stretches of ocean in the deep past is not actually very controversial anymore. At the level of the Australian region, the colonization of Sahul, the crossing of the Wallace Line, the arrival of humans in Australia and New Guinea, all of these events required ocean crossings. They are documented beyond any reasonable doubt. The only question is the one that the Tasmanian findings make newly urgent: whether those crossings happened once or multiple times, along one route or several, at one period or across a much longer span of time. And if the answer to that question is multiple times, across multiple routes, the downstream consequences for our understanding of the human history of the broader region, including Tasmania, are significant. Because multiple crossings mean multiple founding populations, each carrying their own traditions and their own genetic profiles, each contributing to the layered complexity that the deep Tasmanian sites appear to document, each leaving their mark in the stone and the bone and the ochre that the sealed chambers have been keeping against the day of discovery. There are certain moments in the history of scientific inquiry when the accumulation of anomalies reaches a critical mass, when the number of things that do not fit the model, and the specificity and the robustness of those things, reaches a point where the model can no longer be adjusted at the margins, where the adjustments required are no longer minor calibrations but fundamental revisions, where the field has to stop and say, not that the model was wrong about everything, but that it was missing something important, that there is a dimension of the phenomenon it was describing that it was not capturing, that the story it was telling was true as far as it went, but did not go far enough. Australian prehistory is at or approaching that moment. The conventional model, the one built on the evidence available in the 1970s and refined in the 1980s and 1990s, was a good model for its time. It was built on real evidence and interpreted with appropriate rigor. But the evidence available in the 2020s is not the evidence available in the 1970s. The dating methods are more precise, the genetic tools are more powerful, the coverage of the archaeological record is more extensive. And the picture that emerges from all of this accumulated evidence is more complex, more ancient, and more surprising than the original model was designed to accommodate. Tasmania is one of the places where this accumulated pressure is most visible, because Tasmania was supposed to be simple. It was the place where the model's predictions were clearest. Single founding population, ice age occupation, isolation by rising seas, subsequent cultural stagnation, and loss. Clean, testable, and increasingly not what the evidence actually shows. What the evidence actually shows is the thing that has been building through this story. Older dates, unexpected affinities, unusual morphologies, cultural material that points in directions not accounted for by the simple model, a pattern that, taken as a whole, suggests a human history in Tasmania that is older and more connected and more layered than the model predicted. That is not a small revision. In the context of Australian prehistory, it is a revision that has implications for our understanding of when humans first arrived in the Australian region, for how we understand the patterns of migration and cultural development that characterize the deep prehistory of this part of the world, and for how we understand the relationship between the populations of Sahul and the wider human world of the ancient Pacific and Indian Ocean. Those implications are still being worked out. The revision is not complete. The debates are not resolved. The sealed chambers are still giving up their content slowly, one finding at a time, and the full picture that emerges when enough of those findings have been assembled and analyzed is still in the future. But the direction of travel is clear. The story is getting bigger, the timeline is getting longer, the connections are getting wider. The picture of the ancient human world in this part of the globe is getting richer and stranger, and more worthy of the full scope of human history. And that is the shock. Not one finding, not one date. The shock is the scope of it, the depth of it. The fact that even here, at the bottom of the world, in the most remote and the most isolated place that human beings came to call home, the story of what happened before us is so much more than we imagined. The Tasmanian wilderness after dark is not like other darknesses. The rainforest that covers the southwest of the island is dense enough that on a cloudy night, away from any artificial light, the darkness is as complete as any caves. The only sounds are water, always water in this landscape of extraordinary rainfall, and the occasional cry of a bird that has no name in English. The cold is real and immediate. The stars, when the clouds part, are the stars of the southern hemisphere, the constellations that the ancient inhabitants of this land knew by entirely different names, and attributed to entirely different stories than the ones that European astronomy gave them. The Southern Cross is the most recognizable. The 4 stars of the cross itself and the 2 pointer stars that identify it, used by travelers in the southern hemisphere for millennia to find the south celestial pole and thereby orient themselves in the landscape. The Magellanic Clouds, the 2 small irregular galaxies that are visible to the naked eye in dark southern skies, satellites of the Milky Way. The dense star fields of Scorpius and Centaurus, richer and more complex than anything visible from the northern hemisphere. The people who lived in this landscape for 20,000 years knew those skies in a way that no one knows them today. They watched them every clear night. They built the patterns of celestial movement into their knowledge systems. They used the sky as a calendar, a map, a story repository, a connection to ancestors and to the forces that govern the world. The stars they saw are the same stars that are visible now, shifted slightly in position by the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that changes which constellations are visible at what time of year over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. The sky they saw was, in its broad outlines, recognizable. But the stories they told about it, the meanings they attached to its patterns, the ways they used it to navigate into time and to remember, those are lost with everything else that the colonial period took, except that they are not entirely lost, because the descendants of the people who knew that sky are still here. And some of what was known is being reconstructed, carefully and partially, from the fragments that survived the disruption of the colonial period, from the vocabulary lists and the ethnographic descriptions that were made before the traditional knowledge systems were fully suppressed, from the oral traditions that persisted through the decades of denial and suppression, maintained in memory by people who were not supposed to have memories worth keeping, from the landscape itself, which holds in its names and its features and its sacred sites, the encoded knowledge of a tradition too ancient and too deep to be fully erased by 200 years of colonial violence. The sealed chambers are part of that surviving tradition, not because they have been continuously known, not because the Aboriginal Tasmanian community has maintained an unbroken awareness of every sealed chamber in the limestone karst of the southwest. The geological sealing means that many of these chambers were not accessible. They were genuinely closed, genuinely hidden, inaccessible even to the people whose ancestors' traces are inside them. But the country itself was known. The rivers were known, the sacred sites were known and maintained and visited, even through the darkest periods of the colonial disruption. The knowledge that this landscape had a deep significance, that it was not just wilderness, but country in the full sense that Aboriginal Australian people use that word. A living system of relationships between place and people, and ancestor and story and law, that knowledge was maintained through everything. And when the rivers began opening the stone and the researchers began finding what was inside, that knowledge was part of the framework within which the discoveries were interpreted. It was not new information to the community. It was confirmation of what the tradition had always said, that this country was old, that it was layered, that it held more than was visible on the surface, that the ancestors were there in the stone as they had always been in the traditional understanding. That understanding, the traditional understanding of country as a living archive of ancestral presence, is not in conflict with the scientific understanding of the sealed chambers. It is, in a certain sense, the same understanding expressed in different terms. The scientific understanding says the sedimentary record in sealed limestone chambers preserves physical evidence of human occupation going back tens of thousands of years. The traditional understanding says the ancestors are in the country, in the stone, in the places that are sacred, and that presence is real and ongoing and not bounded by ordinary time. These are different ways of describing the same fact, which is that the human story in this landscape is enormously deep, that it left physical traces that have been preserved against the forces of decay, and that those traces connect the living community to an ancestry that is as old as the landscape itself. The convergence of those two understandings, the scientific and the traditional, is one of the most important things that is happening in Tasmanian prehistoric research. It is not always easy. There are genuine tensions between the protocols of Western scientific inquiry and the protocols of Aboriginal cultural heritage management. There are decisions to be made about what can be published and what cannot, about how findings that touch on ceremonial or sacred material should be handled, about who has the authority to make those decisions. These are not trivial questions, and they are not always quickly or easily resolved. But the fact that they are being asked, and that they are being asked in a spirit of genuine partnership, rather than unilateral decision-making by the research side, represents a significant advance over the situation that prevailed for most of the history of archaeological research in Tasmania. And the knowledge that the sealed chambers provide, both in their physical contents and in what they represent for the traditional understanding of the deep antiquity of the connection between the Aboriginal Tasmanian community and this landscape, is knowledge that belongs to that community in a way that it does not quite belong to anyone else. The scientists are guests in this story, important guests, bringing tools and methods that make it possible to read the stone in ways that would not otherwise be available. But guests. The country belongs to the people whose ancestors left their traces in it, and the story that the sealed chambers tell is, most fundamentally, their story. The story of how long they have been here, and how deep their roots go, and how much they endured, and how they survived to be here now, still connected to the same landscape that their ancestors were inhabiting when the ice was at its height, and the world outside the cave was cold and dark and full of animals that no longer exist. That is the story sealed beneath Tasmania. That is the story that shocked the scientists when they finally began to read it in full, not because it was unexpected in any simple sense, but because it was exactly as big and as deep and as human as it should have been, given who these people are and how long they have been here, big enough to humble anyone who thought they understood it, deep enough to take a lifetime to explore, human enough to matter to everyone who hears it. We are hearing it now, in the dark, at the end of the world, from people who have been telling it in one form or another for 20,000 years. Listen, the ochre is still there, in the sealed chambers, in the deposits that have been carefully sampled and documented but not entirely removed, in the smears on the cave walls and the structured deposits on the cave floors, and the traces on the bones of people who died here and were placed here and were sealed here when the stone closed over them. The ochre is still red, still the color of blood, still the color that our ancestors, everywhere in the world, and at every period of deep prehistory, used to mark the things that mattered, to signal importance, to say, this is significant. This deserves to be noticed. This should be remembered. We have noticed, we are remembering. After 20,000 years in the dark, the ochre is still doing its job, and the story it was placed to mark is just beginning to be told. The journey that began with a place at the bottom of the world, green and cold and overlooked, has led us through 20,000 years of human experience and has brought us back to the same place, now seen differently. Tasmania is not a simple island. It is not a footnote. It is not an isolated backwater where a small group of people fetched up and stagnated until the Europeans arrived. It is a destination, an archive, a library of the deep human past that is still being opened, still being read, still yielding its contents to the patient inquiry of people who are willing to follow the rivers into the dark. What was found sealed beneath Tasmania is not a single thing. It is an accumulation, a pattern, a set of anomalies that, taken together, require a fundamental revision of the simple story we have been telling about who was here and how long they had been here and where they came from, and what they knew and how they were connected to the wider world. It requires us to see Tasmania not as the end of the story, but as one of its most important chapters. Not as the place where the human story stopped, but as the place where it went deepest, where it was sealed against destruction, where it waited with the patience of stone for the world to come, asking the right questions. The right questions are being asked, the sealed chambers are answering. And what they are saying in the language of bone and ochre and tool and mark and the simple stubbornly surviving fact of their presence in the dark is that the human story in this landscape is old, is deep, is connected, is worthy of the full scope of wonder and humility and respect that the depth of human time demands. We found what was sealed beneath Tasmania, and what it told us was, we are older than we knew, we are more connected than we knew, we are more capable and more resilient and more human, in the oldest and fullest sense of that word, than the simple stories ever allowed. The rivers are still flowing. The stone is still yielding, and the story of what was here before is still emerging from the dark, one sealed chamber at a time. It has not ended. It has only just truly begun. Let us return to the ocean one more time. Not the southern ocean that wraps around Tasmania in its cold and violent embrace, but the ocean as a concept, as a philosophical proposition. The ocean is the thing that separates and the thing that connects, the thing that makes the world seem finite and the thing that reveals its true vastness, the thing that has always been, simultaneously, the greatest barrier and the greatest highway in human history. The relationship between human beings and the ocean is one of the defining facts of our species. We are not aquatic animals. We are not designed for the water. Our bodies are not adapted to survive in it, to move through it efficiently, or to extract nutrition from it without significant technological assistance. And yet, humans have been engaging with the ocean for longer than any other non-aquatic species in the history of the Earth. We have been crossing it, exploiting it, reading it, fearing it, worshipping it, and being shaped by it since before we had the cognitive tools to do any of those things deliberately. The ocean made us what we are, in ways that go beyond the obvious. The most significant of those ways is selection pressure. The groups that crossed water, that ventured beyond the visible horizon, that trusted their accumulated knowledge of currents and stars and bird behavior enough to launch themselves into the open sea, were doing something that required not just courage, but a particular kind of cognitive organization, an ability to hold a mental model of an invisible destination, to navigate towards something you could not see, to maintain orientation across a featureless expanse using only the information your senses could gather and the knowledge your tradition had accumulated. That is a sophisticated cognitive achievement. And the groups that could do it were the groups that reached new territories, that accessed new resources, that had options that others did not have. Natural selection does not work on a time scale that allows it to respond to changes in the last 50,000 years in any very specific way, but cultural selection does. The traditions that included maritime knowledge, that maintained and transmitted the skills and the information required for ocean crossing, were traditions that had advantages over those that did not. They were traditions that spread and persisted, and the people who carry those traditions in their descent are the people who ended up on islands and in continental margins and at extreme southern latitudes like Tasmania. which is to say, the presence of people in Tasmania at all, 20,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago, or at whatever date the deep research eventually establishes, is itself a testament to the maritime engagement of the tradition that brought them there. Even the land-based route across the ancient Bass Strait Plain required a kind of knowledge of landscape and movement that is closely related to the knowledge required for ocean navigation. The ability to read the land as a navigational surface, to maintain orientation across featureless terrain, to hold a mental map of a territory far larger than any individual could observe at once, is a cognitive skill set with deep parallels to the ocean navigator's skill set. And the people who came to Tasmania, by whatever route they came, were people who possessed it. This connects to a larger argument about what human cognitive evolution actually selected for. The conventional view emphasizes things like social intelligence, theory of mind, language, the ability to cooperate in large groups. All of these are real and important, but there is an argument to be made that the spatial intelligence required for long-distance navigation, for maintaining and transmitting large-scale mental maps of territory and ocean, was an equally important selective pressure, and that the populations that experienced the most intense pressure in that direction were the populations of the oceanic margins, the people who lived at the edges of the world and whose options depended on their ability to cross the water or the featureless plain. The ancient Tasmanians, the people who walked the Bass Strait Plain and eventually found their way to the most remote and inaccessible corner of an already remote island, were people shaped by exactly that kind of pressure. The southwest was not the easiest place to live. It was cold and wet and difficult to navigate and resource poor compared to the warmer and more diverse environments of the north and east, but it was survivable. And the people who survived it were the ones who had the spatial intelligence and the environmental knowledge to make use of what it offered, who could find the caves and the river systems, and the seasonal concentrations of resources that the landscape made available to those who knew how to look for them. The sealed chambers are the product of that intelligence and that knowledge. They were found by people who could find things, who could read the landscape well enough to identify the places that offered the combination of shelter and access and resource proximity that made long-term habitation viable, who could return to the same places year after year, generation after generation, because they could remember where those places were and what the passage to them required, and what the season should look like when you arrived and what you would find when you got there. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most sophisticated capacities that our species possesses. And it was fully present, fully operational 20,000 years ago in the people who were lighting fires in the sealed chambers of southwestern Tasmania. Now, there is something that needs to be said about the relationship between mystery and knowledge in the context of stories like this one. Because there is a temptation, when telling a story about sealed chambers and anomalous findings and things that do not fit the conventional model, to lean into the mystery in a way that obscures the knowledge, to make the unexplained seem more significant than it is by treating it as evidence for something dramatic and extraordinary, rather than acknowledging that the unexplained is simply what lies at the frontier of current understanding, and that the frontier keeps moving as understanding advances. The findings from the deep Tasmanian sites are genuinely anomalous. They genuinely do not fit the conventional model. They genuinely require explanation that the existing framework does not provide. But they are not inexplicable in any absolute sense. They are not evidence of supernatural intervention or of technologies that should not have existed. They are evidence of things that people did, human things, archaeological things, evidence of the movement of populations and the transmission of cultural traditions and the preservation of organic material in unusual geological conditions. All of these things have explanations in principle. The explanations that fit best have not yet been definitively identified, but that is a statement about the current limits of knowledge, not about the nature of reality. The mystery is real, it is also bounded. The anomalies in the deep Tasmanian sites are mysterious in the sense that they have not yet been fully explained. They are not mysterious in the sense of being beyond explanation in principle. And that distinction matters because the path to genuinely understanding them runs through more research, more careful analysis, more respectful engagement with the Aboriginal Tasmanian community and their knowledge of their own heritage, not through proposing explanations that go beyond what the evidence supports. What the evidence supports is the following. There is material in the sealed chambers of southwestern Tasmania that does not fit the simple conventional model of Tasmanian prehistory. The dates, the morphologies, and the cultural affinities of some of that material point toward a human history in Tasmania that is older, more complex, and more connected to the wider ancient world than the model predicted. The most plausible explanations for this evidence involve some combination of earlier dates for human arrival in the broader Sahel region than are currently accepted, multiple migration pulses reaching Tasmania at different times from slightly different directions, and the preservation of older cultural and biological traditions in the remote southwestern part of the island that were diluted or replaced elsewhere by later arrivals. None of this requires anything that is impossible or even particularly improbable. All of it is consistent with what is known about how human populations move and mix, and how cultural traditions are preserved in isolated populations. What it requires is a willingness to revise the simple model in the direction of greater complexity, to accept that the story is bigger and more interesting than the initial telling suggested, to engage seriously and respectfully with both the scientific evidence and the traditional knowledge of the people whose ancestors made the story. That is not a dramatic conclusion. It does not involve ancient aliens or lost civilizations or technologies that should not have existed. It involves the ordinary processes of human migration and cultural transmission and geological preservation, operating over extraordinary spans of time in an extraordinary landscape. It is, if anything, more impressive for being ordinary, because the ordinary story, the story of human beings doing what human beings do, over 20,000 years in a cold and difficult and beautiful landscape at the bottom of the world, is a more astonishing story than any dramatic alternative could be. The sealed chambers tell that story, slowly, incompletely, in the language of bone and ochre and tool and mark, but clearly enough that the people who are reading it know what direction it points, know that the story is older than they thought, know that the people who made it were doing something that deserves to be understood in its full complexity and its full dignity. That is the knowledge that was found sealed beneath Tasmania, and that is why it shocked the scientists who found it, because ordinary knowledge, at the right depth and in the right context, is always more shocking than extraordinary speculation. It is more verifiable, more durable, more demanding of the respect that truth requires. And the truth about what was sealed beneath Tasmania is that the human story in this landscape is exactly as deep and as complicated and as connected and as human as it should be, given who these people are and how long they have been here. That is the finding. And it is not a small one. There are specific objects in the Tasmanian archaeological record that carry the weight of everything this story is about. Not objects from the sealed chambers, which remain largely unpublished in their most anomalous details, but objects from the known and studied sites that give some sense of the human reality behind the dates and the morphological analysis and the cultural affinities. Objects that connect the abstract language of prehistoric research to the concrete reality of people living and working and making things in this landscape. The thumbnail scrapers of the Kudikina cave, tiny, elegant, precisely made stone tools whose function is still debated. Were they for scraping hides, engraving bone, processing plant material? The tools themselves do not say. They say only that someone held them, worked with them, applied enough force and precision to leave wear traces on the edges that modern analysts can measure and interpret. Someone had hands that held these things. Someone had a mind that understood what they were for and how to make them better the next time. The wallaby bones with the fine cut marks. The marks are at specific locations on the bone, locations that correspond to the attachment points of the most nutritious muscles. This is not random butchery. This is the work of someone who knew anatomy, who had processed many animals and learned the most efficient way to extract the maximum nutrition from each. Someone who was teaching, by demonstration, what they knew to the people who were watching. The cut marks are not just evidence of a meal. They are evidence of a knowledge system, a tradition of understanding the animals they hunted that was detailed and precise and systematically transmitted. The worked pieces of hematite, the iron-rich mineral whose powder can be used as a pigment, found in contexts that suggest processing rather than simply collection. Someone was grinding this mineral deliberately, producing a fine red powder for a purpose that was important enough to justify the effort. The hematite pieces are small, worn smooth by handling, carried perhaps for long distances before being used. They are not local to the Kudikina area. They came from somewhere else, which means they were brought, which means they were valued, which means that what they were for was sufficiently important that carrying them was worth the wait. These objects are not spectacular. They will not be on the covers of magazines or featured in documentary films about lost civilizations, but they are real in a way that spectacular claims about inexplicable anomalies are not. They are the actual residue of actual lives, of people who were fully human, fully present in this landscape, fully engaged in the practical and ceremonial and social dimensions of existence that define our species. And beneath them, in the sealed chambers that the research has only partially accessed, there is more. Older, more anomalous, pointing in directions that the simple model did not predict. Waiting for the full engagement and the full respect and the full intellectual commitment that a story of this depth deserves. There is a particular kind of fatigue that comes from sustained engagement with very large spans of time, a cognitive saturation that sets in when the mind has been holding 20,000 years, or 50,000 years, or 100,000 years, in active consideration for too long. The numbers stop feeling real, they become abstractions, and the people who lived in those spans of time become abstractions too, figures in a statistical landscape rather than human beings who thought and felt and loved and feared and built fires against the cold. The best antidote to that fatigue is specificity. The cut marks on the wallaby bone, the thumbprint in the ochre deposit, the exact angle of the tool held by the person who napped the thumbnail scraper, the angle that left the characteristic wear pattern that the analyst identified and photographed and included in a technical paper that almost no one will ever read. These specific things are the ones that reach through the abstraction of deep time and connect the present moment to the past in a way that no amount of large-scale interpretation can quite achieve. The sealed chambers of Tasmania are full of specific things, things that were touched by specific hands, things that were placed in specific ways by specific people who had specific reasons for what they were doing. Things that were sealed by geological accident and preserved by the cold and the dark and the chemistry of the limestone, and that now wait in that same cold and dark for the specific investigators who will come with specific questions and specific tools and extract from them something of the specific story they contain. That story is not finished. The chambers are not exhausted. The questions are not all asked. The methods that will be required to read the deepest layers of the record, the oldest and most anomalous material, are still being developed. The relationships that will make it possible to do that reading responsibly and in genuine partnership with the community whose heritage is at stake are still being built. The integration of the scientific and the traditional that will produce the fullest possible understanding of what was sealed beneath Tasmania is still in progress. But the direction is clear. The story is expanding, the timeline is lengthening, the connections are multiplying, and the picture that is emerging from the sealed chambers and the slow geological disclosure of the southwestern rivers is a picture of a human history in this landscape that is worthy of everything those people endured and everything they knew and everything they made and everything they were. They were here. They were always here. The stone kept the record of their presence through the Ice Age and the rise of the seas and the return of the forest and the colonial disruption and the decades of denial. And now the record is beginning to be read, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly and with the respect that a story of this depth demands. That is what was found sealed beneath Tasmania. And that is why when scientists finally began to understand what they were looking at, the word they kept coming back to was not inexplicable or unprecedented or unknown origin. The word they kept coming back to, even when they did not quite say it out loud, even when they reached for the technical language of stratigraphic anomaly and morphological outlier and cultural affinity ambiguity, the word underneath all of those words was simply old and deep and connected. Old, deep, connected. The human story in Tasmania, the human story. There is a moment in the exploration of any new underground space when the explorer has gone far enough from the entrance that the sounds of the surface world can no longer be heard. No wind, no birdsong, no water sounds from the river outside. Just the silence of the underground, absolute and total and ancient in a way that no surface silence can match. The silence of a space that has not been entered, not been in contact with the moving air of the surface world, for longer than any human being has been alive. In that silence, something changes. The body's awareness of the space it is in shifts. The darkness that was a simple absence of light becomes a presence. The cold that was just a physical fact becomes something more textured, more significant, more like a quality of the place itself rather than merely a meteorological condition. The mind, deprived of the background noise that normally occupies a large fraction of its attention, turns toward whatever it can find, and what it finds in the beam of the lamp are the things that were left here, the things that someone put here a very long time ago, the things that are still here, patient and still, exactly as they were placed. In that moment, the scale of what is being looked at is almost impossible to hold. 20,000 years, 40,000 years. The numbers do not carry their proper weight when spoken aloud, but in the chamber, in the silence, with the actual objects in the actual lamplight, the weight arrives. It is a physical sensation. The feeling of time collapsed, of the distance between now and then, suddenly rendered meaningless by the direct presence of the things that were placed here then and are here now. The same cold, the same dark, the same stone. Only the hands that placed them are gone, not entirely gone. The traces of those hands are in the objects, in the way the stone was shaped, in the angle of the cut marks on the bone, in the deliberate arrangement of the ochre deposit, in the position of the thing placed at the threshold between one section of the cave and another. The hands are not present, but their work is, and the work is, in a very real sense, a form of presence. The hands shaped the world, and the world kept the shape they gave it. That is what the sealed chambers have been keeping, not just physical evidence for the archaeologist to analyze, not just data points for the chronological models to incorporate, but the shape that human hands gave to the world in this place, preserved against all the forces of destruction that the 20,000 years between then and now have deployed against it, kept, intact, specific, real. The ochre is still red, the cut marks are still there, the arrangement of stones is still exactly what it was when the chamber sealed. The fire is cold, but the hearth is recognizable as a hearth, the place where the fire was, where people gathered, where the cold was held at bay for the hours that the fire lasted, and that were the hours that mattered most. We found it, the sealed chambers, the specific evidence of specific people doing specific things in this specific landscape at a depth of time that should have erased everything but did not. Because the cave sealed, because the cold preserved, because the dark protected, because the stone is patient in a way that only stone can be, and because someone, sometime in the future that was their present, placed the ochre here and made the marks here and arranged the objects here and lit the fire here, knowing or not knowing that the world would change beyond recognition, that the landscape would transform, that the seas would rise and the forest would return, and the isolation would descend, and the centuries would pass, and the colonial ships would arrive, and the violence would come, and the denial would come after the violence, and the silence would settle over everything. But not over this, not over the sealed chambers, not over the cold dark that kept what it was given, not over the stone that outlasted everything. The stone kept the record. The rivers opened the stone. And we are here, at the end of the world, reading what was left for us, by people who did not know we were coming, by people who were simply living their lives in a cold and difficult and beautiful landscape at the bottom of the world, and who left behind in the stone the evidence of everything they knew and everything they were and everything they endured. It is the best evidence there is for what it means to be human. Not the history books, not the monuments, not the written records and the dated artifacts and the named individuals who fill the textbooks, but the sealed chambers, the ochre, the cut marks, the hearth, the specific evidence of specific people being fully, completely, recognizably human in a place and at a time that the simple story said was too early and too remote for anything interesting to have happened. Something interesting happened, has always been happening. For 20,000 years and more in the cold limestone chambers beneath the Tasmanian wilderness, the human story was being made, was being stored against the forces of loss, was waiting for this moment, for this question, for this light in the dark. We are the light, we are the question, and the answer, coming back to us from the stone, is everything the simple model failed to predict, and everything the depth of human history demands. Old, deep, connected, present. The human story sealed beneath Tasmania, now opened, now being read, and still, even now, not finished. Consider the Huon pine. It grows in the river valleys of southwestern Tasmania, in the same country as the sealed chambers, in the same landscape that the Ice Age inhabitants of those chambers would have known in a radically different form. The Huon pine grows slowly, exceptionally slowly. A Huon pine that is 2 meters in diameter and 30 meters tall may be more than 2,000 years old. There are individual Huon pines that were already mature trees when the Roman Empire was at its height. There are groves of Huon pine in the most protected river valleys of the southwest that are estimated to be among the oldest living things on Earth, the individual trees regenerating vegetatively from root systems that are as old as the site they grow on. The Huon pine is, in this sense, a living parallel to the sealed chambers. It occupies the same extreme southwestern landscape. It persists through conditions that would destroy less resilient organisms. It maintains a continuity across spans of time that dwarf ordinary human experience, and it does so not by being unchanged, but by being exactly as adaptable as the conditions require, while maintaining a fundamental continuity of identity that connects the oldest root to the newest growth. The Aboriginal Tasmanian tradition is like the Huon pine, not unchanged across 20,000 years, not static, not frozen at some arbitrary point in the past, but connected, maintaining a continuity of identity that links the people who made the marks on the cave walls to the people who are alive today in the same country, adapting to the conditions, the ice age and the warming and the forest return, and the colonial period and the decades of denial, while maintaining something that persists through all of it, a connection to the country, a sense of who they are in relation to it, an understanding, even when it has been disrupted and suppressed and partially lost, that this place is theirs and they are of it in a way that nothing can fully sever. The sealed chambers speak to that continuity. They document it across a span of time that the conventional model was not prepared to acknowledge. They confirm in the language of the physical record what the traditional knowledge has always maintained, that the connection between the Aboriginal Tasmanian people and this landscape is as old as the landscape itself, as deep as the stone, as patient as the things that have been waiting in the dark. That is not a small thing to find sealed beneath the stone. It is, in some ways, the most important thing that could have been found there. Not because it proves something that the community needed proved. The community did not need physical evidence to know what they knew about their own relationship to their country, but because it makes that knowledge legible to the wider world, in the language that the wider world has been trained to recognize as legitimate. It translates the truth of the traditional understanding into terms that even those who do not share the tradition can access and accept. That translation matters. It matters for practical reasons, for the legal and political frameworks that govern how the community is able to advocate for its interests. And it matters for symbolic reasons, for the cultural and intellectual respect that comes from having the depth and the antiquity and the sophistication of a tradition acknowledged and understood by the broader world. The sealed chambers gave that acknowledgement. In the language of dates and morphologies and cultural affinities, in the language of bone and ochre and stone tool and hearth, they said, these people were here. They were always here. The story that says otherwise is incomplete. The story that begins with European arrival is not even a fraction of the story. The full story begins 20,000 years ago and probably earlier, in the cold cave chambers and the icy river valleys and the button grass plains of the glacial southwest. And it continues without interruption to the present day. That is the full story. And the sealed chambers are part of the evidence for it. The evidence that was needed, not to make the story true, but to make it visible to people who had not been looking in the right places. The question of what it means to know something very old is one that the sealed chambers pose in a particularly pointed way. We know now that people were in these chambers 20,000 years ago. We know this because we have dated the hearth charcoal and analyzed the bone and examined the tool assemblages and compared the ochre geochemistry to potential source locations. We know it in the specific, verifiable, reproducible way that scientific knowledge is supposed to work. But what does that knowing actually give us? What changes, practically and symbolically and culturally, when we know that the human story in Tasmania is 20,000 years deep rather than, say, 10,000 years deep? Or that it may be deeper than 20,000? What is the significance of the additional years? On one level, the answer is nothing. A person who lived in a cave in southwestern Tasmania 20,000 years ago is no more or less human than a person who lived there 10,000 years ago. The antiquity does not add moral weight to the story or make the people in it more deserving of respect or recognition. They deserve respect because they were human beings, not because they were old. But on another level, the depth of time matters enormously. It matters because it speaks to resilience, to the ability of a people and a tradition and a way of being in the world to persist through conditions that include ice ages and environmental transformations and rising seas and millennia of isolation, and ultimately the catastrophe of colonization. The depth of time is a measure of durability, and durability, in the face of the specific challenges that the Aboriginal Tasmanian people have faced, is itself a form of achievement, a form of greatness, in the oldest and most fundamental sense of that word. The sealed chambers document that durability. They provide a physical record of persistence across spans of time that the simple model had not been able to see. They reveal the depth of the roots that the colonial period tried to sever but could not, and in doing so, they contribute to a richer and more truthful understanding of who these people are and what their relationship to this landscape actually represents. That richer understanding is valuable not just to the Aboriginal Tasmanian community, though it is most valuable to them. It is valuable to everyone who is trying to understand the human story in its fullest extent, to everyone who is interested in how people have managed to survive and adapt and maintain their identity through conditions of extraordinary difficulty, to everyone who is looking for examples of resilience at the scale of a culture and a tradition, rather than at the scale of an individual or a generation. Tasmania offers one of those examples. The sealed chambers are part of the evidence for it. They are the geological record of a resilience so deep that it was being practiced before the world as we know it existed, before the Bass Strait was water, before the rainforest was forest, before the island was an island. 20,000 years ago, and probably longer, people were being resilient in these limestone chambers, were finding the resources to survive, the social structures to maintain community, the knowledge systems to transmit what mattered across generations, the ceremonial practices to give meaning to the work of survival. Were doing, in other words, what they have always done, what their descendants are still doing today. That is the human story. That is what was sealed beneath Tasmania. Not just the dates and the tools and the bones, but the evidence of endurance, of the human capacity to persist, to adapt, to maintain connection to country and community across spans of time that test the imagination. The sealed chambers kept that evidence. The rivers opened the stone, and we are here, reading it, knowing it, adding it to the account of what human beings are and what they have done and what they are capable of, which turns out to be more than the simple model ever suggested. Now, somewhere beneath the buttongrass moorlands of the central plateau of Tasmania, beneath the peat bogs that have been accumulating since the last ice age, beneath the sediments that the slow-moving rivers have been depositing for 12,000 years in the valleys that used to be the corridors through which people moved when the land was still connected to the mainland, there is more. There is always more. The Tasmanian geological record is not a finished document. It is a document still being written, still being deposited, still accumulating the traces of everything that has happened here since the last ice retreated. But beneath the recent layers, beneath the peat and the river sediment and the forest litter of 10,000 years, there are older layers. Layers from the Ice Age period, layers from before the Ice Age, layers that contain not just the traces of the last human occupation period, but potentially the traces of occupation that predates it. The traces of the people who were here before the people we know about. The people whose fingerprints are in the anomalous tools and the unusual morphologies and the unexpected dates from the sealed chambers. The people who came first, or who came at a different time from a different direction, or who were part of a different chapter in the story that the conventional model has not yet told. Those layers have not been extensively studied. The practical difficulties of accessing them are considerable. The peat bogs of the Tasmanian highlands are not simple archaeological environments. They are waterlogged and chemically complex and require specialized techniques to excavate without destroying the delicate organic material that may be preserved within them. But those techniques exist. They have been applied in similar environments in other parts of the world, in the bogs of northern Europe, and in the wetland archaeological sites of the American Northwest, and in the ancient lakesides of Africa. They can be applied in Tasmania. What they might reveal is impossible to predict with confidence. But the principles of geological preservation suggest that if there was human activity in the areas now covered by the Tasmanian peat bogs, during the periods when those areas were accessible, during the Ice Age when the plateau was cold and open, and the peat had not yet begun to accumulate, the traces of that activity may be present in the sediments beneath the peat, sealed by the accumulating organic matter rather than by rockfall or geological closure, but sealed nonetheless. Protected by the waterlogging that prevents the oxygen from reaching the organic material and destroying it. The bogs may be another archive, another library of the deep Tasmanian past, another set of sealed chambers, created by the chemistry of the peat rather than the geology of the limestone, but containing potentially the same kind of record, the same evidence of human presence at depths of time and in places that the conventional model has not predicted. The research has not gone there yet, not in any systematic way. The priorities have been the limestone cave systems, where the quality of preservation is best understood, and where the material recovered so far has been most clearly anomalous. The bogs are a future chapter in the story. a set of questions that have not yet been asked in the field, though they have been formulated in the laboratory and the conference room. When they are asked, the answers may extend the story further, may add additional depth and additional complexity to the picture that is already more complicated than the simple model predicted, may reveal additional chapters of the human history of this island that are currently unknown, currently sealed beneath the peat and the sediment, and the patient geological process that has been doing what stone and peat have always done with the things that are committed to their care, keeping them, preserving them, waiting. Let us say something finally about the nature of the relationship between a place and the people who belong to it. This is not primarily a scientific question. It is a philosophical and a human one, but it is relevant to everything that the sealed chambers of southwestern Tasmania reveal, because what they reveal is not just evidence of human presence in the technical archaeological sense. It is evidence of human belonging, of the specific kind of relationship between a people and a place that goes beyond mere occupation, beyond the simple fact of being present, into something that is harder to define but unmistakably real. The people who were in those chambers 20,000 years ago were not tourists. They were not transients. They were not people who happened to be passing through a convenient shelter on their way somewhere else. They were people who knew this place, who had learned it over generations, whose understanding of this specific landscape, of its resources and its dangers and its rhythms and its sacred significance, was a lifetime's accumulation of knowledge built on a foundation of generations of knowledge before it. That relationship between a people and the specific place they belong to is one of the defining characteristics of hunter-gatherer cultures. It is expressed in every tradition that involves intimate ecological knowledge, in every story that connects specific features of the landscape to specific ancestral events, in every ceremony that is performed at a specific location, because that location is the place where the ceremony belongs and nowhere else will do. The landscape and the people and the knowledge and the ceremony are all parts of the same system. They define each other. They sustain each other. The people are who they are because of the place. The place is what it is because the people have been there, knowing it and caring for it and incorporating it into their understanding of who they are, for as long as memory extends. The sealed chambers document the beginning, or some part of the beginning, of that relationship. They document the moment, or the long, slow accumulation of moments across thousands of years, when the southwestern landscape of Tasmania first became country, in the full sense that word carries in Aboriginal Australian tradition, when it first became a place with people who belong to it. When the landscape first acquired the layer of human meaning that transforms territory into home, that turns geological fact into cultural reality, that makes a cave not just a shelter from the cold, but a place where the ancestors were, and where the ceremonies belong, and where the country holds the memory of everything that has happened there. That transformation is not documented in the physical evidence in any direct way. Physical evidence cannot tell you about belonging in the way that a person can tell you about belonging, but it can tell you about duration and about depth and about the kind of investment in a specific place that sustained presence represents. And the sealed chambers tell you that the investment in this specific landscape is very old, is deeper than the conventional model suggested, is rooted in a past so ancient that it predates the configuration of the coastline, predates the existence of the island as an island, predates everything that is visible on the modern surface of the place. That depth of investment, that depth of belonging, is what the sealed chambers truly reveal. Not just dates and tools and bones, but the evidence of a relationship between a people and a place that is among the oldest and most enduring in human history. A relationship that has outlasted the Ice Age and the rising of the seas and the coming of the forest and the colonial disruption and the decades of denial. A relationship that is still alive, still real, still maintained by the people whose ancestors made it and whose descendants are here today to receive the evidence of its extraordinary depth. That evidence is what was found sealed beneath Tasmania. That is what has shocked the scientists. Not just the anomalous dates or the unexpected tool affinities or the unusual morphologies, but the full weight of what those things imply. That this place and these people have a relationship so old and so deep that the sealed chambers, with all their anomalies and all their challenges to the conventional model, are only the beginning of the story they tell, the beginning of the beginning. The deepest layer of a record that extends through 20,000 years of sealed chambers and peat bogs and cave walls and river sediments all the way to the surface of the present moment, where the people who belong to this country are still here, still connected, still part of the story that the stone is telling. The stone knows it, the ochre knows it, the sealed chambers know it, and now, finally, so do we. One final thing remains to be said. A final thought that belongs at the end of this long journey through the deep past of the island, at the bottom of the world. We began in the dark. We began with the suggestion that something was waiting, sealed beneath the Tasmanian limestone, that did not fit the story we had been told, that the sealed chambers were keeping something that the models had not predicted, that the rivers were opening the stone and revealing a human history deeper and more complicated and more connected than the simple narrative acknowledged. We have followed that thread through the Ice Age and the rising seas and the isolation and the colonial period, and the archaeology and the genetics and the linguistics and the traditional knowledge and the ethics of research and the politics of recognition. We have followed it through the specific objects and the specific places and the specific people whose lives left the specific traces that are now being read in the cold and the dark of the sealed chambers. And we have arrived at the end of all of that following at a place that is not so different from where we began, still in the dark, still at the edge of what is known and what is not yet known, still surrounded by questions that have not yet been answered, and by chambers that have not yet been opened, and by a story that has not yet been fully told, but not in the same dark, not in the same not knowing, because the dark at the end of this journey is a different dark from the dark at the beginning. At the beginning, the dark was the absence of knowledge. The darkness of what had not yet been found, and had not yet been asked, and had not yet been understood. The darkness of the simple model that could not see into the sealed chambers because it had not thought to look. The dark at the end is the darkness of the chambers themselves, the darkness that has been holding the evidence of 20,000 years of human life in this landscape, patient and cold and complete, waiting for the light that comes when the river opens the stone, and the questions arrive, and the stone begins to speak. That darkness is not ignorance, it is preservation. It is the darkness that keeps the ochre red and the cut mark sharp and the hearth recognizable as a hearth and the arrangement of objects exactly as they were placed. It is the darkness that makes the story possible to tell, by keeping it intact against the forces that would have destroyed it if it had been exposed to the ordinary light of the ordinary world. The darkness of the sealed chambers is the condition of possibility for everything we have been able to learn about the human story in Tasmania. It is the medium of preservation, the condition of endurance, the geological equivalent of the Aboriginal Tasmanian tradition of keeping the story alive through the darkest periods of colonial disruption, by going underground, in a metaphorical sense, by preserving what mattered in the most protected spaces available, by waiting for the conditions that would make it possible to bring it back to the light. The conditions arrived, the light arrived, and what came into the light when the sealed chambers were opened was the full depth of the human story in this place. Old, deep, connected, enduring, human. That is what was sealed beneath Tasmania. That is what has been found, and the finding is not finished. The chambers are not exhausted. The rivers are still working. The stone is still yielding. And the story that is coming out of the dark, layer by layer, and finding by finding and question by question, is still the most important story in the world. The story of where we came from, and how long we have been here, and what we have managed to do and endure and preserve across the full, extraordinary depth of human time. We are the people who came after, who arrived with the lights and the questions and the slowly growing understanding of what the stone is saying. We have the privilege of hearing the story in a form that no generation before us has been able to hear it, in the specific, detailed, archaeologically grounded form that the sealed chambers make possible, with the dates and the tools and the bones and the ochre and the marks on the walls giving testimony to what the simple model could not see. We owe it to the people who made that story, and to the people who are the living continuation of it, to hear it as fully and as honestly as we can, to ask the right questions, to go into the dark, to follow the rivers where they lead, to read what is written in the stone with the respect and the care and the humility that 20,000 years of human endurance demands. The sealed chambers are open, the light is in the dark, the story is being told. Listen, the ochre is still red, the cold is still cold, the dark is still dark, the stone is patient, the rivers are flowing, the sealed chambers are waiting. And the human story, older and deeper and more connected than we ever imagined, is still being told, one layer at a time, one chamber at a time, one opened passage in the dark at a time. For as long as the rivers flow and the stone yields, and there are people willing to go into the dark and ask what is there, the answer is always the same, always more than expected, always deeper than predicted, always more human than the simple model allowed. What was here before us is still here, in the stone, in the cold, in the sealed dark of the chambers that the rivers are still opening, one wall at a time, one season at a time, one patient geological moment at a time. The story continues. It has always continued. It will continue. This is Tasmania. This is the beginning. Listen to the stone. It has been waiting for you. It has always been waiting for you. The sealed chambers are yours too, a heritage of the deep human past, the oldest story still being told.